Hey guys! Tonight we're stepping into the cold stone corridors of a medieval castle where a 12-year-old girl stands before a polished bronze mirror. Her hands trembling as servants lace her into a wedding gown. She's never met the man waiting at the altar. She doesn't know his face, his voice, or whether he'll be kind or cruel. But she knows this. Her childhood ended the moment her father signed a contract 3 years ago, and today she becomes someone's property. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, about why marriage once looked so different from the partnership we imagine today. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below. But make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, or maybe share what you think about these historical realities. Your support helps me bring you more of these bedtime journeys. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You're standing in the solar of a Norman castle in 1186, watching your mother examine your face with an expression you can't quite read. Is it pity, pride, resignation? You're only 9 years old, but you've just learned that your betrothal has been finalised. Somewhere in Burgundy, a man of 32 winters has agreed to take you as his wife when you reach your 12th year. You don't understand what marriage means. Not really. But you notice how your mother's eyes glisten in the candlelight. The concept of childhood betrothal wasn't merely common in medieval nobility, it was the cornerstone of political strategy across Europe. Noble families began arranging marriages for their daughters practically from birth, sometimes even before birth. Expectant mothers would negotiate preliminary contracts, hedging their bets on producing a daughter who could be traded for alliance or territory. You've been a chess piece since you drew your first breath. Your father keeps the betrothal contract in a locked chest in his chamber. It's written in Latin on parchment, sealed with red wax, and contains clauses that dictate your entire future. The document specifies your dowry 3 manors in Lincolnshire, 200 marks in silver, 12 horses, and a collection of tapestries that belong to your grandmother. Historians still argue whether these dowries empowered noblewomen by giving them property rights, or simply made them more expensive commodities in a patriarchal market. Here's something quirky that might surprise you. Some betrothal contracts included God clauses that would void the arrangement if either party took monastic vows before the wedding. A handful of clever girls exploited this loophole, running away to convents to escape marriages to men they found repulsive. Church authorities generally upheld these vows, creating family scandals that could destabilize political alliances for generations. Your father made sure no such clause appeared in your contract. You spend your childhood preparing for a role you don't fully comprehend. Your governess teaches you to embroider, to manage household accounts, to speak French alongside your native English, and to dance the carol without stumbling. But she also teaches you something darker: obedience. A wife's duty is submission, she repeats, her voice soft but firm. Rebellion brings only suffering. You're too young to understand why her hands shake when she says this, or why she sometimes touches the faded bruise on her wrist. The waiting period between betrothal and marriage feels eternal. You're in a strange limbo, too committed to be truly free, yet too young to join your future husband's household. You're not allowed to form close friendships with boys your age, because you're already spoken for. You watch your brothers train with wooden swords in the courtyard, their futures full of choices and adventures, while your path narrows to a single destination. During these years, you receive occasional gifts from your betrothed. A jewelled brooch arrives one winter, a palfrey with a side saddle the next spring. These objects feel alien in your hands, Tokens from a stranger who's shaping your life from hundreds of miles away. You try to imagine his face. Is he handsome? Does he laugh easily? Or does he brood like your father? The uncertainty gnaws at you during sleepless nights. Your mother tries to prepare you for what's coming, but her explanations remain frustratingly vague. She speaks in metaphors about wifely duties and the marriage debt, never quite saying what she means. You sense her reluctance, her desire to preserve your innocence for just a little longer. Medieval advice literature for mothers suggested waiting until mere days before the wedding to explain sexual matters, a practice that left countless brides terrified and confused. Here's the uncomfortable truth: the medieval church set the minimum marriage age at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, but these limits were frequently ignored among nobility. Marriages were sometimes consummated when brides were as young as 10 or 11 if political circumstances demanded urgency. The justification girls from noble blood supposedly matured faster than peasant children, a myth that conveniently served political ends. Your 12th birthday approaches like a storm on the horizon. You notice changes in how people treat you. Servants bow more deeply. Your father's knights regard you with new calculation in their eyes. You're no longer a child but a future alliance, a bridge between families. Your younger sisters watch you with a mixture of envy and fear, knowing their turns will come. The youngest, only 6, once asked you if marriage hurts. You didn't know how to answer. The legal reality of your betrothal is binding in ways you're only beginning to understand. Breaking the contract would require papal dispensation or proof of consanguinity blood relation within 7 degrees. Your father has already verified that no such relation exists. You're trapped by ink and wax, by signatures and seals, by the ambitions of men who see you as a means to expand their influence. And that's the joke. Really, they call it giving away the bride, as though you were a gift rather than a human being with thoughts and dreams and fears. As your 12th birthday arrives, servants begin packing your belongings. Trunks fill with linens embroidered with your future husband's coat of arms, a symbol you'll wear for the rest of your life. Your mother weeps openly now, no longer hiding her sorrow. She knows what you're about to face because she faced it herself at 13. Wed to your father sight unseen. The cycle perpetuates itself. Generation after generation, each mother sending a daughter into the same uncertain darkness she once entered. The final weeks before your departure feel surreal. You walk through the castle that's been your entire world, memorizing details you fear you'll forget, the way afternoon light filters through the chapel windows, the smell of bread baking in the kitchens, the sound of your youngest brother's laughter echoing in the great hall. These sensory memories will have to sustain you in whatever strange household awaits. Your trousseau grows daily. Seamstresses work by candlelight to finish your wedding gown. A heavy affair of silk and gold thread that makes you feel like a decorated doll. You stand for endless fittings, arms outstretched, while women you've known your whole life chatter nervously about your future. They avoid your eyes, and you wonder what they're not saying. One particularly odd detail from historical records: some families commissioned special marriage chests decorated with scenes from classical mythology, often depicting the abduction of Helen of Troy or the rape of the Sabine women. Modern historians debate whether these images were meant as warnings, celebrations, or simply reflected the artistic conventions of the time. Your own marriage chest features a painted scene of the Judgment of Paris, where a woman's fate is decided by men arguing over her beauty. The irony isn't lost on you. Even at 12, the night before your journey, your mother finally sits you down for the talk. Her face is pale, her voice barely above a whisper. What she tells you is both too much and not enough medical terminology mixed with euphemism, duty conflated with destiny. You understand that pain is expected, that blood is normal, that your value hinges on producing sons. She gives you a small vial of lavender oil for afterward, and a prayer to Saint Margaret, patron saint of childbirth. You're 12 years old, and you're terrified. Sleep eludes you that final night in your childhood bed. You stare at the timber ceiling, tracing the familiar patterns in the wood, and wonder who you'll become in this new life. Will you be brave? Will you survive? Will you ever stop feeling like a child playing dress-up in an adult's nightmare? Dawn arrives too soon, bringing with it the horses, the guards, the inevitable farewell. Your father looks almost regretful as he hands you into the carriage. Your mother doesn't watch you leave. She's already retreated to the chapel to pray. As your childhood home disappears behind the hills, you press your face to the carriage window and let yourself cry. You're 12 years old. You're travelling toward a stranger who owns you, and this is just the beginning of what medieval society called your duty. The shocking reality. This wasn't considered shocking at all. The negotiation of your marriage began long before you knew your own betrothed's name. Picture a smoke-filled chamber in your father's castle, 2 years before your departure, where men gather around a table laden with documents, wine, and territorial maps. You're not present. Of course, brides never were. But your value is being calculated down to the last silver penny, your future measured in acres and alliances. This is where marriages were truly made, not at altars but at accounting tables, where daughters became the currency of power. Your father sits across from your future father-in-law's representatives, his face carefully neutral. Medieval marriage negotiations could take months or even years, each side manoeuvring for advantage like generals planning a siege. The representatives have travelled from Burgundy with letters of authority, carrying their lord's demands written in precise legal Latin. Your father's scribes have prepared counter-proposals. What follows is a dance of diplomacy where every word matters and you are simultaneously everything and nothing, the entire point of the discussion, yet utterly absent from it. The dowry forms the negotiation's backbone. Your father has offered 3 manors, but the Burgundian representatives want 4. They question the productivity of the Lincolnshire estates. Have the harvests been good? Are the tenants reliable? Do the mills function properly? Your worth is being audited like a merchant's inventory. Historians still argue whether substantial dowries gave noblewomen more security in marriage, or simply made them more expensive purchases, essentially pricing them like luxury goods in a marketplace of flesh and blood. Here's what actually appears in these contracts' property transfers. Yes, but also bizarre specifics that reveal how thoroughly families controlled their daughters' futures. Some contracts specified which servants the bride could bring, which jewels she could keep, even which rooms in her new home she'd be allowed to occupy. One particularly unusual clause found in several French contracts stipulated that if the bride died childless within the first 5 years, her entire dowry reverted to her birth family, essentially a money-back guarantee on a defective product. Your contract contains a similar provision, though no one has explained this to you yet. The dower negotiation proves equally complex, unlike the dowry that you bring to marriage. The dower represents what your husband's family promises you, typically 1/3 of his estates, which you'll control if you outlive him. Your future father-in-law resists this clause. 1/3 is traditional, yes, but his son has expensive tastes and military ambitions. They offer 1/4 instead. Your father's face hardens. This is about your survival, your security if widowhood comes. The argument stretches into the evening, servants bringing fresh candles as the men's voices rise and fall like tides. Political considerations lurk behind every clause. Your marriage will create an alliance between your father's English holdings and your husband's Burgundian influence. Both families have enemies who watch these negotiations carefully. If the terms seem too favourable to one side, it signals weakness. If they're too harsh, it suggests desperation. The balance must appear equitable even when it isn't, and you, the human being at the centre of this arrangement, never factor into the equation as anything more than the mechanism by which lands and loyalties transfer. Let's talk about something that might make you uncomfortable: the marriage portion, sometimes included. Compensation for perceived defects. Was the bride too young? Even by medieval standards, add more land. Was she considered plain, or had she survived smallpox with scars? Reduce the dowry demand. Had there been whispers about her family's loyalty during the last rebellion? Better throw in those disputed fishing rights to sweeten the deal. You're fortunate, young, healthy, reasonably attractive by the standards of people who've never seen you so. Your father negotiates from strength. But you've heard stories of less fortunate girls whose flaws were itemized like damaged goods in a market stall. The treaty also addresses what happens if things go wrong. If you die before consummation, the marriage is void and properties returned to original owners. If you die after consummation but before producing an heir, it gets complicated. Lawyers argue over charts showing which assets transfer, which revert, which remain in dispute. If your husband dies first, you get your dower, but only if you don't remarry without his family's permission. You're 12 years old in a legal document that contemplates your death with the same detached precision it applies to crop yields and water rights. Here's a quirky historical detail that sounds invented, but isn't. Some marriage contracts included provisions for mistress maintenance. The groom's family would openly negotiate how much money the husband could spend annually on concubines without the bride having grounds for complaint. This wasn't universal, but it appeared often enough in southern European contracts that historians have entire debates about whether this represented unusual honesty or simply codified humiliation. Your contract contains no such clause. Though whether that's because your father insisted or because your future husband's family saw no need to formalize what they'd do anyway remains unclear. The negotiations nearly collapse over a territorial dispute. Your father's southwestern manor borders an estate claimed by your future husband's cousin. Who gets the timber rights, the hunting privileges, the tolls from the bridge crossing the stream that marks the boundary? These men argue for 3 days over a strip of land neither has seen in years. While your fate hangs in the balance, you could return to being just a child again if they fail to agree. But somehow that possibility feels more terrifying than moving forward. You've already begun preparing mentally for departure. To reverse now would be like falling backward through time. Finally, they compromise. Additional property exchanges hands. Not the disputed border manor, but a different estate entirely. One that satisfies honour without requiring either side to admit defeat. Documents are prepared in duplicate, then triplicate, each copy witnessed and sealed. Your father signs with his signet ring pressed into hot wax. The Burgundian representatives sign on behalf of their lord, who will add his own seal when the documents reach him, and just like that, your future solidifies into legal reality. You are sold, though no one uses that word. You're betrothed, promised, spoken for. The euphemisms make it sound almost romantic. The contract's final clauses address the wedding itself. Who pays for what? Where it will occur? How many guests each family can bring? Your father agrees to transport you to Burgundy at his expense, along with 12 attendants and your trousseau. Your future father-in-law will provide the wedding feast. The musicians, the priest's fees, even celebration becomes negotiation, each side calculating costs against benefits, ensuring no one gives more than they receive. And at the centre of this elaborate transaction sits a 12-year-old girl who owns nothing, decides nothing, and somehow represents everything these powerful men desire. One of the representatives produces a miniature portrait of your future husband, painted on ivory. Your father examines it briefly, then sets it aside without comment. You'll see it much later, discovering a face that's handsome enough by conventional standards but tells you nothing about the man behind it. Medieval portraits were notoriously flattering anyway. Every noble looked dignified, every lady beautiful, every child angelic. Historians still argue whether these idealized images made arranged marriages easier or harder, by creating expectations reality could never meet. The men share wine to celebrate the agreement, their earlier tension dissolving into forced joviality. They toast your future happiness with a casualness that borders on parody. These men who've spent days haggling over you like farmers, bargaining over a breeding mare, now drink to your joy. Your father returns to the family quarters that evening looking exhausted and somehow older. He doesn't tell you the negotiations are complete. You'll learn that later, when preparations begin in earnest. For now, he simply pats your head and murmurs something about duty and family honour. Words you'll hear, repeated so often they'll lose all meaning. But you never see the private letters exchanged after the public agreements, where your father writes to his counterpart expressing hopes that you'll be treated kindly, and receives assurances that sound sincere but commit to nothing. These personal addendums to formal contracts reveal what the legal language conceals: anxiety, doubt, parental love constrained by social expectation. Your father worries about you, but not enough to stop this. Never enough to stop this. The journey to meet your husband takes 9 days. You travel in a covered wagon that smells of damp wool and horse sweat, accompanied by your attendants and a guard of 20 men-at-arms. With each mile, your stomach tightens. You've memorized every detail of that ivory portrait: the strong jaw, the dark eyes, the hint of a smile that could be kindness or cruelty. But a painting can't tell you how he moves, how he speaks, whether his hands are gentle or rough. You're about to meet the stranger who will control the rest of your life, and no amount of preparation makes you ready. The castle appears on the horizon at sunset, its towers silhouetted against an orange sky. It's larger than your father's home, more imposing, with thick walls that seem designed to keep people in as much as to keep invaders out. Your heart hammers so loudly you're certain your attendants can hear it. They've been whispering among themselves all day, their nervous energy matching your own. Even the guards seem tense. Everyone understands what's at stake: not just your marriage, but the alliance between families, the peace between regions, the success or failure of years of negotiation. And it all rests on how well you and a complete stranger manage to tolerate each other. You're led to a guest chamber to refresh yourself after the journey. Servants you've never seen before bring water for washing, help you change into your finest gown, arrange your hair with trembling efficiency. They've been instructed to make you presentable for the first meeting, to display you like a prize mare brought to a new stable. Your principal attendant, Lady Eleanor, who served your family for 20 years, grips your shoulders and looks into your eyes. "Be brave," she whispers. And remember, men are often more nervous than they appear. You want to ask her how she knows this, but there's no time. A knock at the door announces that your betrothed is ready to receive you. The great hall feels cavernous as you enter. Torches cast dancing shadows on stone walls, hung with tapestries depicting hunting scenes and biblical stories. At the far end, on a raised dais, sits your future husband. He stands as you approach, and your first thought is he's taller than the portrait suggested. Your second thought is he's old. Not elderly, but seasoned, with lines around his eyes that speak of 32 years lived fully while you've barely begun your 12th. The age gap isn't unusual. Medieval noblewomen routinely married men twice their age or more. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it viscerally are entirely different things. You curtsy deeply, as you've been taught. He steps down from the dais and takes your hand, raising you up. His palm is warm, calloused from sword work. He says something in French. Your French is adequate, but his accent is different from your tutor's, and you miss half the words. You catch beautiful and honour and pleased, which seem positive. You murmur the formal response you've rehearsed for weeks. His smile widens slightly. So far. You haven't humiliated yourself. That feels like a victory, however small. Here's what the etiquette manuals of the period prescribed for first meetings. The couple should exchange formal greetings, perhaps a chaste kiss on the hand or cheek, and then separate to allow both parties to contemplate the union in prayer. What actually happened varied wildly. Some grooms were kind, even charming, trying to ease their young bride's fears. Others were indifferent, treating the meeting as a formality to be endured. And some saw their child brides as property already owned, acting accordingly. Historians still argue whether medieval noblewomen's later writings about instant affection for their husbands reflected genuine feeling or simply the stories women told themselves to survive. Your husband leads you to a cushioned chair beside his own and gestures for you to sit. The household assembles his mother, a stern woman in widow's black, his younger brother, barely older than you, various knights, ladies, and servants. They're all staring, evaluating, judging whether you'll be an asset or a liability to their household. You feel your face burning but keep your expression serene. Your mother taught you this, at least the noble face, the mask that reveals nothing. Never let them see you afraid, she'd said. Fear is blood in the water. A feast has been prepared in your honour. Servants bring course after course, roasted swan with gilded beak, pies filled with lamprey, sugared fruits, wine spiced with cinnamon. You can barely eat, your stomach is tied in knots. And the rich food tastes like ashes in your mouth. Your husband seems to notice your discomfort. He leans close enough that you smell wine on his breath and something else. Perhaps clove or rosemary, and says quietly, in simpler French you can fully understand. You don't need to eat if you're not hungry. I remember being nervous at my first formal dinner too. It's such an unexpectedly kind gesture that you feel tears threatening. You blink them back furiously. The evening stretches endlessly. There's music. A minstrel plays a vielle and sings a lie about Tristan and Isolde, which now seems like a cruel joke given your circumstances. There's dancing, though mercifully you're not required to participate on your first night. There's conversation swirling around you in rapid French and occasional Latin, most of it going over your head. You catch fragments talk of harvests, of the king's latest demands for military service, of marriages being arranged for other people's children. The world of adult nobility into which you've been thrust feels overwhelming, incomprehensible, and utterly indifferent to your presence. Here's a detail that might surprise you. Language barriers were common in arranged marriages between regions. Norman French, Parisian French, and Burgundian French could be nearly mutually unintelligible. Never mind marriages that crossed larger cultural boundaries, English to Spanish, German to Italian. Some couples literally couldn't understand each other for months or years. A quirky subset of medieval advice literature actually addressed this, suggesting couples learn together through reading scripture aloud or playing word games. Whether that made the situation better or more absurd is left to your imagination. Eventually, mercifully, the evening ends, your husband stands, which signals everyone else to rise. He turns to you and says, and Lady Eleanor later confirms your understanding, that you'll have time to settle in before the wedding, which is planned for 3 weeks hence. 3 weeks. You have 3 weeks of this liminal existence, betrothed but not yet married, living in his household but not yet fully his property. Part of you is relieved by the delay. Part of you wishes it were tomorrow, just to have the waiting over with. As you're escorted back to your chamber, you pass a window overlooking the courtyard. You see your husband down below, walking alone toward the stables, his shoulders hunched. For just a moment, he looks uncertain, almost vulnerable. Lady Eleanor follows your gaze and murmurs, "He's nervous too. You know, his first wife died in childbed 5 years ago. He's been alone since then." This information lands like a stone in your chest. Your husband is a widower. You're a replacement, stepping into a dead woman's shoes. And somewhere in this castle, there might be a child from that first marriage, a stepchild you knew nothing about. The next morning, you meet your husband's daughter from his first marriage. She's 7 years old, only 5 years younger than you, with her father's dark eyes and a solemn expression that makes her look ancient. She curtsies formally and calls you my lady mother, which sounds absurd. You're 12. You're supposed to be this child's mother, the medieval world thought so. Noble stepmothers were often barely older than their stepchildren, creating household dynamics that range from sisterly to nightmarish. You kneel down to her level and say, "Truthfully, I don't know how to be your mother, but maybe we can be friends." She stares at you for a long moment, then nods once. It's not much, but it's something. Over the next 3 weeks, you begin learning the castle's rhythms. You meet the household staff, the chamberlain who controls the finances, the steward who manages the estates, the cook who rules the kitchens with an iron ladle. You're introduced to neighbouring nobles who come to assess you, their eyes cataloguing your every gesture, word and expression. You practice your French with a tutor your husband has hired, drilling conjugations until your head aches. You walk the gardens with your stepdaughter-to-be, who slowly, painfully slowly, begins to warm to you. You watch your future husband from a distance at meals in the courtyard. Once, when he was training with his knights, trying to understand who he is beneath the formal courtesy, he remains largely a mystery. You've carefully chaperoned conversations where he asks about your journey, your family, your education. He tells you a little about the estate, the local politics, the expectations for your role, but you never discuss anything real of your fears, his grief, what kind of marriage you might build together. Those topics remain forbidden, locked behind the walls of propriety that govern noble interaction. You're two strangers preparing to become legally one flesh, and you know almost nothing about each other beyond the superficial. Historians have documented cases where couples fell genuinely in love despite, or perhaps because of, these strange circumstances. Shared adversity, proximity, and youth's resilience sometimes transformed arranged marriages into real partnerships. But they have also documented the opposite, a lifetime of cold coexistence, of duty performed without affection, of two people sharing a bed and a name but never truly meeting. You don't yet know which version awaits you. The not knowing is its own kind of torture. The wedding day approaches like an executioner's appointment. Your wedding gown is ready. The chapel is being decorated. Guests are arriving from across the region. Everything is prepared except you. You're not ready. You'll never be ready. But medieval noble daughters didn't get to be ready, they simply had to endure. And endure you will, because there's no alternative, no escape, no choice. The shocking reality. Your husband is probably just as trapped as you are, bound by the same expectations, performing the same duty. You're both prisoners of a system that values lineage over love, alliance over affection. But at least he got to be 32 before entering this particular cage. You're still 12. The morning of your wedding, you wake before dawn, your stomach churning with dread. Servants bustle into your chamber carrying heated water, scented oils, and that heavy silk gown you've come to hate. They strip you naked without ceremony. Modesty is a luxury you're no longer afforded, and begin the elaborate process of transforming you into a bride. The water is too hot. The scrubbing is too rough. Everything feels like an assault. A preparation not for celebration but for sacrifice. And perhaps that's exactly what this is. Your hair is washed 3 times with soap made from ash and tallow, then rinsed with rosewater until it shines. It's combed out painfully because you're tender-headed and the servants are in a hurry and arranged in an elaborate style that requires what feels like 100 pins. A circlet of gold inset with pearls is placed on your head, heavy enough that your neck aches within minutes. Your skin is rubbed with perfumed oils until you smell like a garden and feel like an oiled fish. Through it all, you remain silent, docile, disappearing into yourself the way you've learned to do when reality becomes unbearable. The gown comes next. It's a masterpiece of medieval craftsmanship, crimson silk embroidered with gold thread, in patterns of vines and birds. The sleeves so long they nearly touch the floor, the train requiring 2 attendants to manage. It weighs what feels like a stone, and the bodice is laced so tightly you can barely breathe. Medieval wedding gowns weren't designed for comfort. They were designed to display wealth, to advertise the family's status through sheer extravagance. You're a walking treasury, a billboard for your father's prosperity and your husband's acquisition of valuable property. The irony that you can barely move in this symbol of your new life isn't lost on you. Lady Eleanor fastens a necklace around your throat, sapphires set in silver, a gift from your husband that arrived yesterday. The stones are cold against your skin. She steps back to examine you, her eyes suspiciously bright. "You look beautiful," she whispers, "like a queen. But you don't feel beautiful. You feel like a doll, lifeless and painted, arranged for someone else's pleasure." You catch a glimpse of yourself in the polished metal mirror and barely recognize the pale, wide-eyed girl staring back. The castle chapel is packed when you arrive. Every noble family within 3 days' ride has sent representatives, along with local clergy, your husband's knights and their ladies, and what seems like half the countryside. The air is thick with incense, sweat, and anticipation. Candles blaze on every surface, and their combined heat making the space stifling despite the cool autumn morning. Someone has strewn fresh rushes mixed with lavender on the floor, but it doesn't quite mask the smell of unwashed bodies packed into close quarters. This is your wedding part religious ceremony, part political theatre, part community spectacle. Your father leads you down the aisle, his hand gripping your arm perhaps a bit too tightly. Is he steadying you or preventing escape? You're not sure. Your legs feel disconnected from your body, moving of their own accord. The faces blur as you pass, curious, approving, calculating, indifferent. At the altar waits your husband in a deep blue tunic edged with ermine. Looking solemn and impossibly adult, beside him stands the bishop, whose presence indicates the importance of this union. Lesser marriages may do with local priests. Yours merits a bishop in full regalia, his vestments glittering with ecclesiastical gold. Here's what medieval wedding ceremonies actually involved: less romance than you'd imagine. More legal transaction. The bishop begins in Latin, words you've studied but now can't quite follow through your panic. You catch phrases: holy matrimony, procreation of children, remedy against sin. The ceremony is surprisingly short on love and long on duty. Marriage in medieval theology existed primarily to legitimize sex and children, to prevent fornication, to create legal heirs. Any happiness was incidental, a bonus but not the point. The vows themselves are disturbingly straightforward. You promise to obey, to serve, to honour your husband. He promises to protect and provide for you, no mention of obedience on his part. The asymmetry is codified into the very words you speak before God. When the bishop asks if you consent freely, your voice comes out as barely a whisper. I do. It's technically true, no one is literally forcing you at knife point, but calling this free consent stretches the definition to breaking point. Historians still argue whether medieval marriages involving girls as young as 12 could ever truly be consensual, given the complete lack of viable alternatives. Rings are exchanged. Your husband slides a gold band onto your finger, and you do the same for him. Your hands shaking so badly you nearly drop it. The bishop blesses the rings with holy water, murmuring prayers for fertility, for male heirs, for your submission to your husband's will. Then comes the kiss, your first. Your husband's lips brush yours briefly, formally, in front of 300 witnesses. It's awkward and chaste and somehow still feels violating. This public display of intimacy with a man you barely know. The congregation applauds. You've just been transformed from daughter to wife, from your father's property to your husband's, all with a kiss and some Latin words you didn't fully understand. But the ceremony is only the beginning. After Mass comes the wedding feast, which lasts for hours. You sit on the dais beside your husband, picking at food you can't taste while entertainment parades before you. There are jugglers, acrobats, musicians playing rebecks and lutes. There's a fool who makes increasingly bawdy jokes that you don't understand but that make the adults roar with laughter. Servants bring course after course roasted peacock redressed in its own feathers. A subtlety made of marzipan shaped like a castle. Wine that flows continuously. Your husband occasionally speaks to you pleasantries about the food. The music, but mostly he's engaged with the important men around him, conducting business even on his wedding day. Here's a quirky detail that sounds made up but appears in numerous historical accounts at some medieval weddings. Guests would throw objects at the bride and groom for luck, grain, shoes, small coins. One Italian account from 1287 describes a bride nearly knocked unconscious by a thrown boot. Your wedding thankfully omits this tradition, but there are other humiliations to endure. Guests keep toasting your fertility, speculating loudly about how soon you'll produce an heir, making jokes about the wedding night that grow more explicit as the wine flows. You keep your eyes down, your face burning, wishing you could disappear. As evening approaches, the atmosphere shifts. There's an electric tension in the air, a collective anticipation that makes your skin crawl. You realise with creeping horror what's coming next, the bedding ceremony. You've heard whispers about this tradition, but hoped foolishly, desperately that your wedding might somehow skip it. No such luck. When your husband stands and extends his hand to you, the crowd erupts in cheers and knowing laughter. Lady Eleanor appears at your side, her face sympathetic but resigned. "Come," she murmurs. "Better to get it over with." You're escorted to the bridal chamber by a procession of women, married ladies whose presence is meant to ensure the consummation actually occurs. They're singing bawdy songs in French that you mercifully don't fully comprehend, laughing and calling out advice that makes the older women blush. Your husband is simultaneously escorted by men, their voices booming through the castle corridors. This public march to the marital bed is meant to emphasize the community's stake in your union, to witness that the marriage will be properly consummated and thus legally binding. The idea that your most intimate moment will be semi-public makes you want to vomit. The bridal chamber has been prepared. Fresh linens on the bed, candles casting soft light. Rose petals scattered across the coverlet, which would be romantic if the circumstances were different. The women undress you efficiently, removing the heavy gown, the circlet, the jewellery, stripping you down to your shift. One of the older ladies, a baroness you've met exactly once, inspects the bed linens and nods approvingly. They're white, pristine, ready to display the proof of your virginity that will be examined tomorrow morning. Your humiliation is a contractual requirement. Your husband enters, similarly stripped to his shirt by his male attendants. The crowd, yes, they're still here. A dozen witnesses packed into the room watches as you're both blessed one final time by the priest, who sprinkles holy water on the bed and murmurs prayers. Then, finally, mercifully, most of them leave. Most, but not all. Several senior ladies position themselves at the far end of the chamber, far enough for minimal privacy, but close enough to testify that consummation occurred. This is the shocking reality of medieval noble marriage. Even your wedding night isn't truly private. Your husband sees your face. You must look terrified because you're terrified and does something unexpected. He dismisses the remaining witnesses. "Out," he says quietly but firmly. "All of you. My wife and I will produce the evidence you require, but we'll do it alone." There's pushback tradition demands witnesses. What if questions arise about the marriage's validity, but he's immovable? They leave, grumbling, and suddenly you're alone with this stranger who's now legally entitled to your body. The silence that follows is deafening. Your husband pours wine from a carafe on the side table and hands you a cup. "Drink," he says. "It will help." His voice is gentler than you've heard it before, almost kind. You drink. The wine burn in your throat. He sits on the edge of the bed, his bed. Your bed. The bed you'll share for the rest of your life, and says something that surprises you. "We don't have to do anything tonight if you're not ready. We can wait." For a moment, you feel a rush of relief so intense it's almost painful. But then reality crashes back. The marriage isn't valid until it's consummated. The alliance isn't secure. The witnesses are expecting proof. "Waiting only delays the inevitable and might create political complications neither of you can afford." You shake your head. "No," you whisper. Let's just get it over with." And that's perhaps the saddest summary of a wedding night imaginable, not anticipation or desire, but resignation. The grim determination to endure what must be endured. He nods slowly, understanding or at least accepting your decision. What happens next isn't romantic, isn't pleasurable, isn't anything like the courtly love songs suggest. It's awkward, painful, and mercifully brief. And when it's over, you lie beside this man who's now your husband in the legal and biblical sense, staring at the canopy overhead, wondering how many more nights like this stretch before you, and whether you'll survive them with any part of yourself intact. You don't sleep that first night. You lie rigid beside your husband, feeling the unfamiliar warmth of another body in bed, listening to his breathing slow into sleep while your mind races. Your body aches in new ways, and there's blood on the sheets, evidence that will be inspected by matrons in the morning, displayed to confirm your virginity and the marriage's consummation. The humiliation of it makes you want to weep, but you're afraid that crying will wake him, so you swallow the tears and stare into darkness until dawn creeps through these shuttered windows. Morning brings the inspection you've been dreading. While your husband dresses and leaves, he has the luxury of escaping this particular degradation. Senior ladies of the household enter your chamber. They examine the sheets with businesslike efficiency, nodding approvingly at the bloodstains. One of them, your husband's aunt, actually smiles at you. "Well done," she says, as though you've accomplished something praiseworthy, rather than simply endured something painful. The sheets will be shown to selected witnesses, possibly even displayed from a window to announce the marriage's consummation to the broader household. Your most private pain becomes public proof. Here's what medieval medical texts actually said about wedding nights. They're filled with spectacularly terrible advice that made everything worse. Physicians recommended that new husbands approach their brides with vigour to establish dominance. Religious texts suggested brides should remain passive and receptive, like the Virgin Mary receiving the Holy Spirit, a comparison so wildly inappropriate it would be funny if it hadn't shaped countless women's expectations. Some advice literature even suggested that any pleasure a woman felt during intercourse was sinful, that good wives should endure the marriage debt with pious resignation. You weren't prepared for pain, for awkwardness, for the sheer mechanical indignity of it all, because no one prepared medieval brides for reality. The days following your wedding blur together in a haze of adjustment. You're moved from the guest chamber to your husband's rooms, now your rooms which still contain traces of his first wife. A jewelled comb on the dressing table. Embroidery left unfinished in a basket. A prayer book with another woman's name inscribed inside. The servants haven't thought to remove these artifacts, or perhaps they've left them deliberately, a reminder that you're filling a vacancy, replacing someone who came before. You find yourself studying these objects, trying to understand the ghost who haunts your new life. Your body needs time to recover, but your husband returns to your bed the second night and the third and the fourth. Is not malicious, he's simply following the pattern expected of newly married nobles, establishing the physical relationship that will hopefully produce heirs. But you're 12 and sore and terrified, and each night feels like a fresh violation even though it's legal, sanctioned, expected. Historians still argue whether medieval ideas of marital consent even recognised that wives could be unwilling, or whether marriage vows were understood to grant permanent, irrevocable sexual access regardless of the wife's feelings on any given night. Here's something deeply uncomfortable that appears in church records and legal documents. Complaints from medieval husbands that their young brides were failing in their marital duties by showing distress during intercourse. Some men actually sought annulments or church intervention because their wives cried or resisted. The theological position was clear. Wives owed the marriage debt, and emotional reluctance didn't excuse them from payment. A few progressive theologians argued that husbands should be gentle with very young brides. But this was advice, not requirement. Your husband is neither cruel nor particularly gentle. He's simply doing what society expects, oblivious to or unconcerned with your internal experience. You begin learning what's expected of you beyond the bedchamber. As the lady of the household, you're responsible for overseeing female servants, managing the still room where medicines and preserves are made, ensuring the linens are clean and the chapel properly maintained. Your mother-in-law, who still lives in the castle, watches your every move with critical eyes. She corrects your French, your posture, your management decisions. My son's first wife knew how to run a proper household, she says pointedly when you forget to order more beeswax for candle making. The comparison stings, a constant reminder that you're being measured against a dead woman and found wanting. Your stepdaughter remains your one small comfort. 7-year-old Isabel attaches herself to you with unexpected fervour, perhaps because you're closer to her age than any other adult in the household. She shows you her favourite hiding spots in the castle, a window seat in the tower where sunlight pools warmly, a corner of the garden where lavender grows wild. She teaches you the names of the dogs and horses, the complicated politics of the servant hierarchy, which cook makes the best honeyed cakes. In teaching you, she seems to heal something in herself, filling the mother-shaped absence with this strange new relationship. You're grateful for her, this small person who needs you, who makes you feel useful rather than merely ornamental. But Isabel also reminds you of what's expected. You're meant to produce more children, particularly sons. The pressure is immense and immediate. At meals, guests ask pointed questions about whether you're feeling nauseous, yet a supposed early sign of pregnancy. Your mother-in-law consults with the castle's herb wife about fertility tonics, foul-tasting concoctions of honey, wine, and various plants that you're expected to drink daily. The priest prays publicly for your womb to quicken. Every month that your courses arrive feels like a public failure, though privately you're relieved. The thought of pregnancy at 12 is terrifying beyond measure. Medieval medical understanding of reproduction was spectacularly wrong but believed with absolute confidence. Physicians thought women had to experience pleasure to conceive, which meant that rape victims supposedly couldn't get pregnant. And infertile wives must be frigid. They believed monthly courses purged women of excess blood that made them mentally unstable. They thought carrying female children was easier than males because girls were cooler and less vigorous in the womb. None of this was true, but it shaped how you're treated, what's expected, how your body is understood and managed by others. 3 months into your marriage, your courses are late. The household erupts in excitement. Your mother-in-law orders you confined to your chambers. Too much activity supposedly causes miscarriage in early pregnancy. You're forbidden from riding horses, from walking the battlements, from doing most things that made your new life bearable. The herb wife brings increasingly noxious tonics. Servants tiptoe around you as though you're made of glass. Your husband visits your chamber but doesn't touch you. Intercourse during early pregnancy was believed dangerous. For 2 weeks, you're treated like a precious, fragile vessel whose only purpose is nurturing the potential heir you're carrying. Then your courses arrive, heavy and painful, and the excitement turns to disappointment so thick you can taste it. Your mother-in-law's face hardens. Servants whisper. Your husband says nothing, but you catch him looking at you with something that might be concern or might be frustration. You can't tell which. Don't know him well enough to read his silences. The worst part is your own confused reaction, relief that you're not pregnant, shame at failing expectations, and guilt for feeling relieved. You're 12 years old, your body is still changing, and you're supposed to bear children for a man who's essentially a stranger. Here's a quirky detail from medieval gynecological texts. They contain dozens of supposed fertility tests, most completely useless. One suggested placing garlic in the vagina overnight if your breath smelled of garlic in the morning. Your womb was open and fertile. Another recommended urinating on wheat and barley seeds. Whichever sprouted first supposedly indicated the sex of your next child. Women desperate for pregnancy tried these absurd remedies because they had nothing else. Because infertility could mean divorce, rejection, even accusations of witchcraft. You haven't tried the garlic test, but you've considered it in desperate moments. Your relationship with your husband remains distant, formal. He's not unkind. He ensures you have fine clothes, adequate servants, spending money for the market. He doesn't beat you, which some wives in the castle whisper about as though it's exceptional virtue rather than basic decency. But he doesn't know you, doesn't seem particularly interested in knowing you. Your conversations remain surface-level household matters, estate business, weather observations. You've never discussed your fears, your homesickness, your confusion about this strange new life. He's never mentioned his first wife, his own feelings about this arranged marriage, whether he finds the situation as strange as you do. Sometimes, late at night, you wonder about his first wife. How did she die in childbed? Was it the baby's birth or complications afterward? Did he love her? Does he compare you to her? And if so, how do you measure up? Isabel occasionally mentions her mother. Small comments about how she used to sing certain songs or tell particular stories. These glimpses of the woman who preceded you make her feel more real and somehow more threatening. You're haunted by someone you never met, competing with a ghost for relevance in your own marriage. The isolation is perhaps the hardest part. You're surrounded by people, servants, ladies in waiting, your husband's family, but you've never felt more alone. Your attendants from your father's household was sent back after the wedding. Keeping a bride's original servants was considered poor form, suggesting divided loyalty. The women here are polite but distant, loyal to your mother-in-law rather than to you. You've tried writing letters home, but your mother-in-law insists on reviewing them first, to ensure you're not sharing household matters inappropriately. Your words are monitored, edited, sometimes simply discarded. You're cut off from everyone who knew you before, trapped in a place where you're simultaneously the lady of the household and utterly powerless. Historians have documented the profound isolation many young noble women experienced after arranged marriages. Moved far from home, forbidden from maintaining previous relationships, monitored constantly by their new family, they lived in a kind of luxurious imprisonment. Some adapted, building new connections and finding purpose in their roles. Others spiraled into depression, documented in letters and chronicles that describe women who stopped eating, stopped speaking, simply withdrew into themselves. You're not there yet, but you can feel the pull of that darkness on particularly difficult days. 6 months into marriage, you still feel like you're playing a role rather than living a life. You say the right words, wear the right clothes, perform the right duties, and lie in the right bed at night. But inside, you're still that 12-year-old girl who left home crying in a carriage. Except now there's nowhere to return to. Your father's castle isn't your home anymore. This place isn't home either. It's a posting, a duty station, a cage you're learning to navigate. And the shocking reality, this is supposed to be normal. This is what marriage means for noble girls' displacement, adjustment. The slow erasure of who you were in favour of who you're expected to become. The wedding night was just one night of pain. The real challenge is the lifetime of small deaths that follows, each day chipping away at your old self until you can't quite remember who you were before. The first time you try to leave the castle grounds without permission, you make it as far as the outer gate before the guards politely but firmly turn you back. "My lady," the captain says, his eyes not quite meeting yours. "Lord Henri has instructed that you're not to travel beyond the walls without proper escort." You're stunned into silence. You hadn't realised you needed permission to take a walk. You hadn't understood that marriage meant trading one form of supervision for another. Stricter version. The gate that keeps enemies out also keeps you in. Your movements are monitored constantly. When you walk the gardens, a lady-in-waiting shadows your steps. When you visit the chapel to pray, someone always accompanies you. When you want to ride one of the few pleasures you brought from your old life, a groom must be summoned. Routes must be approved, and you're never allowed beyond sight of the castle towers. It's all framed as protection, concern for your safety, proper noble decorum. But you're learning that protection and imprisonment can look remarkably similar, and the language used to describe them is often identical. Here's what medieval law actually said about married women's autonomy they had almost none upon marriage. A woman's legal identity was covered by her husband, a doctrine called coverture that meant she couldn't own property independently, sign contracts, or even write a legally binding will without his consent. You're one of the wealthiest women in the region by virtue of your marriage and dowry, yet you can't spend a single coin without approval. The household accounts you supposedly manage are reviewed and ultimately controlled by your husband and his steward. You're a lady in title but a child in authority. Your correspondence is the first casualty of your new restrictions. Letters from your mother arrive opened, read by your mother-in-law before reaching you. Your replies are similarly scrutinized when you protest tentatively. Because you're still learning the boundaries of acceptable objection, your mother-in-law explains that it's standard practice to ensure you're not being manipulated by your birth family or sharing sensitive household information. The explanation sounds reasonable until you realize it means you can't write honestly about your loneliness, your fears, your reality. Every letter becomes a performance of contentment you don't feel. You're not allowed to form close friendships with the lower servants. When you begin chatting regularly with one of the kitchen maids, a girl near your age who makes you laugh with her imitations of the pompous chamberlain, your mother-in-law intervenes. "Ladies don't befriend servants," she says coldly. "It undermines household order." The maid is reassigned to the laundry, where you rarely see her. The message is clear, even your relationships are subject to approval and management. You're permitted companionship only with women of appropriate rank who've been vetted by your new family. Historians still argue whether medieval noblewomen's restricted mobility was primarily about control or genuinely about safety. Roads were dangerous, banditry common, and a lord's wife represented valuable ransom potential. But the restrictions extended far beyond reasonable security measures. Women couldn't attend markets without chaperones. They couldn't visit neighbours casually. They couldn't even move freely within their own homes. Certain areas like the armoury or the lord's private study remained off limits. The architecture of castles often included separate women's quarters where ladies were expected to spend most of their time, engaging in appropriately feminine activities like needlework and prayer. Your daily schedule is rigidly structured. You rise at dawn for private prayers, then attend Mass in the chapel. Breakfast is a formal affair in the Great Hall, where you sit beside your husband in prescribed silence while he discusses estate business with his knights. Mornings are devoted to household management, inventorying linens, consulting with the cook about menus, inspecting the still room's production of medicines and preserves. Your mother-in-law observes these activities, correcting your decisions, occasionally overruling you entirely. You're learning the role, but slowly, and every mistake is noted. Afternoons bring needlework sessions with the other ladies' hours spent embroidering altar cloths, mending garments, creating the decorative textiles that signal wealth and piety. You've never enjoyed needlework, but it's the primary acceptable activity for noble women. Your stitches are adequate but uninspired, which your mother-in-law mentions frequently. "My son's first wife created the most exquisite work." She sighs, displaying a chasuble covered in gold thread so fine it must have taken months to complete. Another comparison, another reminder of your inadequacy. You bend over your embroidery hoop and concentrate on making your stitches smaller, neater, more like a proper lady's work should be. Here's a detail that might surprise you. Medieval noblewomen's days were minutely regulated by handbooks on proper behaviour. These conduct manuals written by men naturally prescribed everything from walking face slow and dignified to facial expressions serene, never laughing loudly to posture straight-backed, hands folded. You're supposed to be a living embodiment of virtue, your body a display of your family's honour. Any deviation too loud, too casual, too comfortable reflects poorly not just on you but on your husband, your family, your entire lineage. The pressure to perform femininity correctly is exhausting and unrelenting. Your husband controls even intimate aspects of your life. He decides when you'll try for another pregnancy after your courses regularize. The herb wife recommends specific days for intercourse based on lunar cycles and humoral theory. He determines what you'll wear to important events, sometimes selecting your jewellery and gowns personally. He approves or denies your requests for new books you love reading. But he considers too much learning inappropriate for women, potentially damaging to your womb's fertility. When you ask to learn Latin beyond the prayers you already know, he laughs indulgently and suggests you focus on more practical skills. Your intellect, like your body, belongs to someone else now. The irony is that you're simultaneously powerless and responsible for everything. When the household runs smoothly, your husband receives credit for maintaining good order. When something goes wrong, servants quarrel, supplies run low, a guest is inadequately entertained, you're blamed for poor management. You have all the accountability but none of the actual authority. Your mother-in-law can override your decisions. The steward can ignore your instructions if he deems them unwise. Your husband makes final determinations on everything significant. You're a manager without management power, a leader who can't actually lead. 6 months into your marriage, you're still not allowed to visit your family. You've requested this multiple times. Your younger sister is getting betrothed, and you desperately want to attend the ceremony. Your husband refuses. It's too far, he says. The roads are unsafe. Perhaps next year. But you suspect the real reason he doesn't trust you to return willingly. You're valuable property now, and property doesn't get to wander away, even temporarily. The separation from your birth family is part of the transfer. You belong to his household completely, and maintaining strong ties to your former life might complicate that ownership. Here's something genuinely disturbing from legal records. Husbands could legally forbid their wives from seeing their own parents or siblings. Some marriage contracts explicitly included clauses limiting how often and under what circumstances a bride could visit her birth family. The logic was that divided loyalties threatened marital harmony, that wives might be manipulated by their fathers into acting against their husbands' interests. But the effect was to isolate women completely, cutting them off from everyone who knew them before marriage, everyone who might support them if the marriage turned abusive or dangerous. Your isolation deepens when you finally make a friend, or think you do. Lady Marguerite, the wife of one of your husband's knights, is close to your age and seems genuinely kind. She invites you to her chambers for private conversation, and for the first time since your wedding, you feel like you might have an ally. You share carefully edited versions of your homesickness, your struggles adjusting. She sympathizes, shares some of her own experiences. It feels like connection, like relief. Then, 2 days later, your mother-in-law confronts you about complaining inappropriately about your marriage. Every word you spoke to Marguerite has been reported. You've been betrayed, and you didn't even realize you were being tested. You become more guarded after that, more careful. You learn to smile when expected, to express contentment you don't feel, to perform satisfaction with your circumstances regardless of reality. Medieval women's letters that survive show this pattern, public correspondence full of dutiful platitudes, but private notes smuggled out via trusted servants, written in cipher, or simply never sent, revealing desperation. Loneliness, sometimes even suicidal ideation. You're not suicidal. Not exactly, but you understand the appeal of disappearing, of ceasing to exist under this constant surveillance and restriction. The castle begins to feel like a beautiful prison. The tapestries on the walls might as well be bars. The courtyard garden where you're allowed to walk is just a larger cell. The marriage bed is an obligation you can't refuse. You have fine clothes, adequate food, protection from physical danger, and absolutely no freedom. And when you dare to feel ungrateful because you're not being beaten, you're not starving, you're not physically tortured, guilt crashes over you. Shouldn't you be thankful other women have it worse? Why can't you simply accept your role and find contentment within these boundaries? Historians have documented how medieval women internalized their restrictions, coming to believe that their confinement was natural, divinely ordained, even desirable. Religious texts taught that female autonomy led to sin. Remember Eve's independence in the garden, and that submission brought spiritual rewards. Women who chafed at restrictions were labelled proud, rebellious, unfeminine. Even your own thoughts become sites of surveillance. As you police yourself, question your own dissatisfaction. Wonder if the problem is you, rather than the system that constrains you. Do you remember your wedding day? That moment when you promised to obey. You didn't fully understand what you were promising. Obedience isn't just about following instructions. It's about the erasure of your will, the sublimation of your desires, the constant negotiation between who you are and who you're required to be. Every day you wake up and perform the role of dutiful wife, obedient daughter-in-law, future mother. Every night you lie beside a man who owns you legally, religiously, socially, and every moment in between you're watched, monitored, corrected, shaped into the form your new family requires. The shocking reality: this was considered normal. This was protection. This was security. Medieval noblewomen were simultaneously privileged and imprisoned, wealthy and powerless, honoured and controlled. The restrictions weren't cruelty, they were custom. The surveillance wasn't abuse, it was propriety. And if you felt suffocated, isolated, trapped well, that was your failure of gratitude, your inability to appreciate the advantages of your position. After all, you're fed, clothed, protected, and married to a man of good standing. What more would a woman possibly want? Freedom, autonomy. Those were dangerous, unfeminine, unthinkable. Your cage is gilded, lined with silk, heated against the winter cold, but it's still a cage. And you're only beginning to understand that the door locked behind you the moment you spoke your wedding vows. Your first real pregnancy scare comes 8 months into marriage, and this time the signs seem unmistakable. Your courses are late 3 weeks, then 4. You're nauseous every morning, retching into a basin while your ladies-in-waiting exchange excited glances. Your breasts ache constantly. The herbwife examines you with rough, efficient hands and announces what everyone's been waiting to hear: you're almost certainly with child. The household erupts in celebration. Your husband actually smiles at you warmly for the first time in months. You're doing what you're supposed to do. You're finally succeeding at being a wife. But beneath the household's joy, you're terrified. You're 13 years old. Your body barely looks like a woman's. You're still growing yourself. Your hips narrow, your frame slight. You've heard the whispered statistics among the women: childbirth is the leading cause of death for women your age. Your husband's first wife died this way. Your own mother lost 2 sisters in childbed. The romanticized image of motherhood dissolves when you actually face the prospect of something growing inside you, something that will have to come out, something that might kill you in the process. Medieval pregnancy was surrounded by superstition, prayer, and spectacularly useless medical intervention. The herbwife gives you a leather pouch to wear around your neck containing a slip of parchment with prayers to Saint Margaret, written in red ink. Supposedly this prevents miscarriage. You're instructed to avoid looking at ugly things, lest the baby be marked with deformity. If you see a hair, you must touch your belly 3 times to prevent the child from developing a cleft lip. You're forbidden from reaching overhead, from sitting cross-legged, from consuming any food considered cold in its humoral properties. The restrictions multiplied daily, each one supposedly protecting the precious air you're carrying. Here's what medieval medicine actually believed about pregnancy: that the womb was a separate creature inside women, capable of wandering through the body, causing hysteria, that male children formed on the right side of the womb, females on the left, that the baby's sex could be influenced by which side you slept on, what foods you ate, even the direction of the wind on the day of conception. Physicians would seriously examine your urine colour, the shape of your belly, the glow of your skin, all to predict whether you carried a boy or girl. Everyone wants you to be carrying a boy. No one says this directly, but the pressure is palpable in every interaction. Your confinement begins almost immediately. You're restricted to your chambers and the adjacent solar, a small suite of rooms that become your entire world. Fresh air is considered dangerous to pregnant women. You're allowed brief walks in the enclosed garden, but never beyond the inner courtyard. Visitors are limited to family and close household members. Your days contract to an endless cycle of needlework, prayer, and waiting. The isolation that characterized your married life intensifies until you feel like you're disappearing into yourself. The physical changes are disturbing and fascinating in equal measure. Your body is doing things without your permission, transforming in ways you can't control. Your belly swells, your breasts enlarge, your face rounds. You're hungrier than you've ever been, but also nauseous, craving strange combinations, honey and pickled fish, bread soaked in wine, raw onions. The cravings are supposedly mystical messages from the baby about what it needs. You're told that denying a pregnant woman's craving can mark the child, so your bizarre requests are indulged. It's the only area where your desires take precedence over household convenience. Historians still argue whether medieval pregnancy was medicalized or spiritualized, whether women's bodies were treated as mechanical processes requiring expert intervention, or as sacred vessels requiring prayer and protection. The answer seems to be both simultaneously. The herb wife visits weekly to palpate your belly, to check the position of the baby, to prescribe tonics that taste like dirt and grass. But the priest also comes regularly, blessing you with holy water, hanging protective medallions around your neck, praying over your womb. Your pregnant body becomes a contested site where medicine and religion compete for authority. Here's a genuinely disturbing practice from historical records. Some noble families hired women who'd successfully birthed many sons to sleep in the same room as pregnant noblewomen, the theory being that their fertility would transfer through proximity. You're spared this particular indignity, but you're required to attend when the neighbouring baroness gives birth, supposedly witnessing a successful delivery prepares you for your own. What you witness instead traumatizes you. The screaming, the blood, the way the baroness's body seems to tear itself apart. She survives, barely, and produces a healthy son. Everyone congratulates her. You return to your chambers and don't sleep for 3 days. Your relationship with your husband shifts during pregnancy. He's solicitous in ways he wasn't before, asking after your health, sending you small gifts, sweetmeats, a new prayer book, a cushion embroidered with protective symbols. But he also stops visiting your bedchamber. Medieval medical texts warned that intercourse during pregnancy could damage the baby, mark it, or cause miscarriage. You're relieved not to perform that particular duty, but the physical distance creates emotional distance too. He's interested in you as an incubator, not as a person. His kindness is directed toward the baby you're carrying, not toward you. The waiting becomes unbearable. Medieval pregnancy lasted what felt like forever without reliable ways to determine conception dates. Women could be pregnant for 10 or 11 months if their cycles were irregular. You count days obsessively, trying to calculate when this will end. The quickening when you first feel the baby move is supposed to be a joyful milestone. Instead, it makes everything more real and therefore more terrifying. There's something alive inside you, dependent on you, that will eventually have to emerge. The inevitability of it haunts your dreams. Your stepdaughter Isabel becomes your constant companion during confinement. At 8 years old, she's fascinated by your pregnancy, asking endless questions you can't fully answer because you barely understand what's happening yourself. She places her small hand on your belly to feel the baby kick, her face lighting up with wonder. "Will you love the baby more than me?" she asks once, her voice small. The question breaks your heart. "Never," you promise, meaning it. She's the only genuine relationship you've built in this household. The only person who seems to see you rather than just your function. Then, at what you calculate must be around 5 months, the cramping starts. At first, you ignore it. Pregnancy is supposed to be uncomfortable. But the cramping intensifies. And then there's blood. Not just spotting, but serious bleeding that soaks through your shift. You call for help, your voice shrill with panic. The herb wife comes running, examines you, and her face goes carefully neutral, the expression people make when delivering bad news. "You're losing the baby," she says quietly. And just like that, your brief period of value ends. The miscarriage is physically agonizing and emotionally devastating. But what surprises you is the household's reaction or lack thereof. There's no mourning period, no ritual acknowledgement of loss. Within a day, life returns to normal as though nothing happened. Your mother-in-law's face hardens with disappointment. Your husband visits once, briefly, to ensure you're recovering, but his warmth evaporates. You failed at the most fundamental task of a wife. The baby that never was becomes something you're not supposed to discuss, a private shame rather than a shared grief. Here's what medieval medicine blamed for miscarriage as the mother. If you miscarried, it meant you'd done something wrong, lifted something heavy, eaten the wrong foods, experienced excessive emotion, had weak humoral balance. The possibility that miscarriage was common, natural, often unavoidable, didn't align with the medieval worldview that everything happened for a reason, usually divine judgment or human failure. So women who miscarried carried not just grief but guilt, wondering what they'd done to deserve this punishment. You grieve alone in your chambers while the household moves on. You grieve for the baby you never met but somehow already loved. You grieve for the brief period when you felt valuable, necessary, important. You grieve for your body's betrayal, its failure to do the one thing that might have secured your position in this household. And underneath all that grief lurks relief terrible, guilty relief that you're not pregnant anymore, that you've been granted a temporary reprieve from the terror of childbirth. The contradictory emotions make you feel like you're splitting apart. Medieval women's private writings reveal that miscarriage was far more common than public records suggest. Some historians estimate that up to half of all pregnancies ended in miscarriage or stillbirth, but these losses remain largely undocumented, unacknowledged, treated as shameful failures rather than medical realities. Women supported each other through these losses in private female spaces, sharing remedies, prayers, and stories. But publicly, miscarriage was silence, a void where a child should have been. Your courses return 6 weeks after the miscarriage, and with them comes renewed pressure. The herb wife brings new tonics, more potent and more foul-tasting. Your husband returns to your bed with renewed frequency. The whole household seems focused on getting you pregnant again as quickly as possible, as though the lost baby can simply be replaced with a new attempt. No one asks how you're feeling emotionally. No one acknowledges that you're still mourning. Your grief is inconvenient, and inconvenient emotions are ignored until they disappear. Do you remember when you first learned you might be pregnant? That moment of pure terror mixed with resignation. Now you understand that terror was justified. Pregnancy isn't just uncomfortable or inconvenient, it's dangerous, potentially deadly, and you might have to face it repeatedly for the next 20 years. Medieval noblewomen typically gave birth every 18 months to 2 years if they were fertile, spending most of their childbearing years either pregnant or recovering from pregnancy. The prospect stretches before you like an endless corridor of risk, pain, and loss. 14 months into your marriage, you still feel like a child playing at being an adult, but your body is being forced into adult experiences: sex, pregnancy, miscarriage without your consent or readiness, the shocking reality. This was normal. Girls your age throughout medieval Europe were experiencing the same trajectory: early marriage, immediate pregnancy pressure, the constant risk of maternal mortality, your terror, your grief, your sense of being overwhelmed. These were unremarkable, expected, not worthy of special concern. You were simply a wife doing what wives were supposed to do, trying, failing, trying again, until eventually you succeeded or died trying. The medieval marriage bet wasn't whether you'd face childbirth, it was whether you survive it. 3 months after your miscarriage, your mother-in-law decides you're ready for additional responsibilities. Grief is self-indulgent, she announces one morning. Work is the cure for melancholy. And so you're thrust into the full scope of household management, not the supervised, limited version you've been practicing, but actual authority over a castle that houses over 200 people, including family, knights, servants, and various dependents. You're 14 years old, still mourning a lost pregnancy, and suddenly responsible for an operation more complex than many modern businesses. The sheer scale is overwhelming. You oversee the kitchen staff, a head cook, 2 assistant cooks, 3 scullery maids, a pantler who manages bread, a butler who controls the wine cellar, and various serving boys. You manage the laundry, which requires 6 women working constantly to keep the household in clean linens. You supervise the dairy, the brewery, the bakehouse, the smokehouse where meat is preserved. You coordinate the chamberlains who maintain the living quarters, the grooms who care for horses, the kennelmen who manage the hunting dogs. Each area has its own hierarchy, its own customs, its own petty disputes that somehow become your problem to solve. Here's what medieval household management actually involved. You're running a small village that happens to be organised around a single family. You must ensure there's enough food stored for winter barrels of salted pork, wheels of cheese aging in the cellars, grain sufficient to last until next harvest. You track inventory constantly, knowing that running short means people go hungry and that waste reflects poorly on your stewardship. Account books become your constant companion, filled with entries you struggle to make sense of. The steward helps, but he's also testing you, watching to see if you'll prove capable or if your husband married an incompetent child. The daily decisions are endless and often impossible. The head cook and the chamberlain are feuding over who has priority access to the main hearth. 2 kitchen maids were caught stealing food. Do you dismiss them immediately or show mercy? Knowing their families depend on their wages, a merchant has delivered cloth that's inferior quality to what was ordered. Do you accept it at reduced price or send it back and risk offending a business relationship your husband values? Every choice has consequences, and you're making dozens of them daily with incomplete information and inadequate experience. Your stepdaughter Isabel continues to shadow you, and you realise she's learning what you're learning, how to run a noble household. At 8, she already understands more about preserving fruit and managing servant schedules than seems possible for a child. You're teaching her, yes, but she's also teaching you, sharing knowledge her mother passed down and that the household staff taught her in the years between her mother's death and your arrival. There's something both touching and desperately sad about this arrangement. 2 girls, one barely older than the other, trying to master adult responsibilities neither is truly ready for. Medieval household management guides written for noblewomen are remarkably detailed and demanding. They prescribe the exact order servants should be awakened kitchen staff first, before dawn, then chamber servants, then stable hands. They specify how to test wine for poison, have the server drink from each cup before serving the lord. They detail recipes for removing stains from fine cloth, treating common ailments, managing aggressive servants, and keeping accurate financial records. You're supposed to know all this instinctively, to embody centuries of accumulated domestic knowledge at age 14. The gap between expectation and reality is a chasm you're constantly falling into. Here's a detail that reveals just how much power you theoretically hold. You control the household keys. A massive ring of iron keys hangs from your belt keys to the wine cellar, the spice cupboard, the linen closets, the silver storage, the granary. These keys represent access to the household's wealth, and carrying them publicly signals your authority. But they're also heavy, jangling constantly as you move. A physical reminder of responsibility that's literally weighing you down. Some nights you dream about losing the keys, about theft or waste happening on your watch, about failing in ways that would shame your husband and justify your replacement. The kitchen is perhaps your greatest challenge. The head cook, Master Bertrand, is a 40-year-old man who's worked in this household for 20 years. He knew your husband's first wife. He remembers when your husband was a boy, and he clearly resents taking orders from a teenage girl who knows nothing about food preparation at scale. He questions your menu selections, ignores your instructions about spice usage, spices are expensive, and you're trying to manage costs and make subtle jokes about your inexperience that the other kitchen staff find hilarious. You lack the authority to dismiss him. He's too valuable, too connected, so you're stuck in a perpetual power struggle you're slowly losing. Historians still argue whether medieval noblewomen actually managed their households or simply provided symbolic oversight, while stewards and senior servants ran everything. The answer seems to vary by household and by the individual woman's competence and determination. Some noblewomen were formidable administrators who truly controlled every aspect of their domains. Others were figureheads, going through prescribed motions while real power resided elsewhere. You're trying to be the former but often feel like the latter, issuing orders that may or may not be followed, making decisions that might be quietly reversed by servants who've decided you don't know what you're doing. The financial aspect is particularly bewildering. Your husband's estates generate income from rents, agricultural production, mill operations, and market tolls. Expenses include servant wages, food and supply purchases, building maintenance, taxes owed to the king, charitable obligations to the church, and entertainment costs for the constant stream of guests. You're supposed to track all this, to ensure income exceeds expenses, to identify waste and improve efficiency. The steward presents you with account books written in a mix of Latin and French, using abbreviations and terms you barely understand. You nod as though you comprehend, then spend hours later trying to decipher what you've approved. Here's something genuinely surprising from household records. Medieval noblewomen often engaged in surprisingly complex financial activities. They made loans, invested in trade ventures, managed property portfolios, and negotiated contracts. Your own mother-in-law, it turns out, increased the estate's value significantly during her tenure as lady of the household through shrewd investments in a wool processing operation. She watches your fumbling financial management with visible disappointment. My son's first wife had a natural head for figures. She mentions casually while reviewing your accounts. Another comparison. Another ghost outperforming you. The healthcare responsibilities fall heavily on you as well. The still room, a dedicated space for preparing medicines, preserves, and beauty preparations, is your domain. You're expected to know which herbs treat which ailments, how to compound tonics for everything from fever to melancholy, when to call the physician versus treating illnesses yourself. The herb wife teaches you, but there's so much to learn and the stakes are high. When a stable boy develops infected wounds after falling from a horse, you treat him with a poultice you prepared. He recovers, and you feel a rush of accomplishment. But you also know that if he died, the responsibility would have been yours. Medieval medicine in the still room combined genuine pharmaceutical knowledge with utter nonsense. Willow bark tea actually does reduce fever. It contains the compound that becomes aspirin. Honey genuinely prevents infection in wounds. But you're also taught to prepare lunary water that supposedly strengthens the brain by being distilled under a full moon, and to create amulets filled with herbs to ward off evil spirits causing disease. Separating what works from what superstition is impossible. The theoretical framework explains both equally. And you lack the scientific method to distinguish placebo from actual treatment. You develop a routine, rising before dawn to attend Mass, then making rounds through the household to address overnight issues before breakfast. You meet with the steward, review requests from servants who need various permissions or supplies, inspect the kitchens to ensure proper cleanliness, check on any sick household members, and consult with the chamberlain about upcoming events requiring preparation. By mid-morning, you're exhausted, but the day has barely begun. There's needlework to supervise, menus to plan, disputes to mediate, accounts to review. You fall into bed each night too tired to think, which is perhaps the only mercy in this relentless schedule. Your husband occasionally expresses satisfaction with your management, which feels like winning a minor battle in a war you're slowly losing. But his praise is conditional, always accompanied by suggestions for improvement or comparisons to how things were done before. The household runs adequately. He tells his brother one evening when he thinks you're out of earshot. She's learning, though she lacks her predecessor's natural aptitude. Adequate. You're adequate. After months of exhausting work, you've achieved adequacy. The disappointment stings more than overt criticism would. Do you remember when household management seemed like it might be interesting, perhaps even empowering? The reality is that you're a middle manager with enormous responsibility and limited authority, supervised by your mother-in-law, questioned by the steward, undermined by long-time servants, and judged constantly by your husband. You're performing skilled labour that's simultaneously essential and undervalued. Your success is taken for granted while your failures are meticulously catalogued. And you're doing all this while still being a child yourself, while still grieving a miscarriage, while still trying to understand the foreign household you've been thrust into managing. The cruel irony is that this experience is supposed to be preparing you for even greater responsibility. If your husband dies, you'll manage these estates entirely during your son's minority, assuming you eventually have a son. If you're widowed without children, you'll manage your dower properties independently. The skills you're painfully acquiring now are necessary for your survival later. But knowing that doesn't make the present any easier. It just adds future pressure to current stress. Another layer of expectation to the crushing weight of responsibility you're already carrying. Medieval noblewomen's actual daily lives were far more complex and demanding than romantic or tragic narratives suggest. You're not spending your days languishing in towers, pining romantically, or being decoratively feminine. You're doing hard, skilled work that would break many modern administrators. You're managing human resources, supply chains, finances, healthcare, food service, facilities, and household diplomacy simultaneously. And you're expected to do it all while maintaining perfect feminine deportment, producing heirs, submitting to your husband's authority, and never complaining about the impossible standards you're held to. The shocking reality. This is what marriage meant for noblewomen, not just a change in relationship status, but assuming responsibility for a complex organisation while having minimal training, limited authority, and your competence constantly questioned because of your age and gender. The first time your husband strikes you, it's over something trivial you contradicted him in front of his knights about the date of an upcoming feast. His hand connects with your cheek before you even register he's moved, the crack echoing through the sudden silence in the great hall. Your face burns, your eyes water, but worse than the physical pain is the humiliation. The 36 witnesses who just watched your husband discipline you like a disobedient child. No one intervenes. No one gasps in shock. This is normal. This is allowed. This is, according to medieval law and custom, his right. You flee to your chambers, your ladies-in-waiting trailing behind in uncomfortable silence. Lady Eleanor, the one attendant from your father's household who is eventually allowed to join you, tries to comfort you. Men have tempers, she says quietly, pressing a cool cloth to your reddening cheek. It's best not to contradict him publicly. Save disagreements for private moments. The advice is practical, even kind, but it also normalizes what just happened. She's not saying it was wrong, she's saying you provoked it, and you need to learn better management strategies for your husband's violence. Here's what medieval law actually said about husbands striking their wives. It was legal within limits. The principle of moderate correction allowed husbands to physically discipline wives for transgressions, similar to how fathers could discipline children or masters could discipline servants. The definition of moderate was vague and largely left to individual interpretation. Generally, it meant you couldn't cause permanent injury, disfigurement, or death. Bruises, welts, even broken bones that healed properly, these fell within the acceptable range of marital correction. Your husband has broken no law. He's simply exercising his authority as your legal guardian and master. The violence doesn't become constant, which somehow makes it worse. If he beat you regularly, you'd perhaps build psychological defenses, develop numbness, learn to predict patterns. Instead, the strikes come unpredictably when you've spent too much on household supplies, when a servant reports that you questioned your mother-in-law's instruction, when you're not enthusiastic enough during intercourse, when he's frustrated about something entirely unrelated and you're simply available. You live in a state of constant anxiety, monitoring his moods, adjusting your behaviour, trying to anticipate and avoid his anger. It's exhausting in ways that have nothing to do with physical impact. Historians still argue whether medieval marriage was inherently violent or whether domestic abuse was less common than modern assumptions suggest. Records are incomplete. Wives rarely reported abuse because it wasn't illegal, and neighbours didn't intervene in private family matters. Some evidence suggests that excessive violence was socially condemned even if legally permitted, that communities sometimes ostracized men who brutalized their wives egregiously. But excessive is relative, and your husband's occasional strikes don't approach what medieval society would consider worthy of censure. He's not a monster. He's just a man exercising the rights his society grants him over his property, which is what you are. Legally speaking, your mother-in-law's response when you cautiously mention the incidents is chilling in its casualness. "Of course he disciplines you," she says, not looking up from her embroidery. "You're young and foolish, mate. How else will you learn? My late husband struck me regularly in our early years. It made me a better wife." She says this as though discussing weather patterns, as though violence is simply a natural feature of marriage that women must weather and adapt to. And perhaps, in her worldview, it is. She's not defending cruelty. She genuinely believes correction is necessary, even beneficial, a form of instruction that shapes disobedient wives into proper helpmeets. The physical violence is sporadic, but there are other forms of correction that occur more regularly. Your husband withholds affection as punishment, going days without speaking to you beyond necessary communication, moving to a different chamber when he's displeased, publicly ignoring you at meals while engaging warmly with guests. He controls your access to things you enjoy when you displease him. He forbids you from riding, from having new books, from visiting the garden. He uses intimacy as reward and weapon, alternating between tenderness and cruelty in ways that keep you perpetually off balance, never quite sure which version of him you'll encounter. Here's a detail from medieval conduct literature that's genuinely disturbing some advice. Manuals for husbands specifically recommended strategic use of affection and withdrawal to train wives properly. One text compares managing a wife to training a horse. Reward desired behaviour immediately, punish undesired behaviour swiftly, maintain unpredictability to prevent complacency. These weren't fringe ideas, but mainstream guidance written by respected clergy and scholars. Your husband probably hasn't read these texts explicitly, but he's absorbed the principles through cultural osmosis. He's not inventing abusive tactics. He's following a playbook his society has refined over centuries. You learn to read his moods with survival-level accuracy, the set of his jaw when he's irritated, the particular silence that precedes explosion, the overly formal tone that signals you've displeased him. You adjust your behaviour constantly, becoming a shapeshifter who reflects back whatever version of yourself might avoid his anger. You're obsequious when he wants deference, cheerful when he wants entertainment, passionate when he wants enthusiasm, invisible when he wants to be left alone. The exhaustion of constantly performing acceptable wifehood is its own form of violence, a grinding away of your authentic self until you can't remember who you were before you learned to be so carefully compliant. The isolation intensifies the abuse's impact. You can't discuss this with your family, letters are monitored, and admitting marital problems would shame them. You can't confide in household servants they're loyal to your husband. And Lady Marguerite already taught you that trust is dangerous. The other noblewomen you occasionally encounter at social gatherings maintain cheerful facades about their own marriages, participating in a collective fiction that aristocratic marriage is dignified and harmonious. To admit struggle would be to fail at the fundamental feminine duty of making marriage work regardless of circumstances. Church teaching provides no comfort. When you tentatively approach the chaplain after a particularly bad incident, your husband shoved you into a wall, leaving bruises on your shoulders, the priest's response is to remind you of Ephesians' wives. Submit to your husbands as to the Lord. He suggests more prayer, greater obedience, examination of how your behaviour might have provoked righteous correction. The possibility that your husband might be wrong, might be sinful in his violence, isn't even considered. You're the variable that needs adjustment. Your husband's authority is divinely ordained and therefore above question. Historians have documented rare cases where medieval women sought church intervention for domestic violence, usually when it became extreme broken bones, serious burns, threatened murder. Church courts could theoretically grant separation from bed and board, allowing wives to live apart from abusive husbands while remaining legally married. But these separations were rare, difficult to obtain, and brought shame on the wife for failing at her primary duty. Most women simply endured, lacking any practical alternative. Divorce wasn't an option. Returning to your birth family would disgrace them. Running away meant poverty, vulnerability, social death. So you stay, because staying is the only survivable choice. Your relationship with your stepdaughter becomes complicated by the violence. Isabel inevitably hears or sees incidents the castle isn't large enough for complete privacy. You catch her watching you with concern after your husband slaps you at dinner for laughing too loudly. She asks, with heartbreaking directness, "Does Papa hurt you?" You want to be honest, to validate her perceptions, to name what's happening. But you also know that undermining her relationship with her father serves no purpose and might make her feel responsible for protecting you, a burden no 8-year-old should carry. So you lie. Sometimes adults disagree, and your father reminds me of my place. It's normal. The words taste like ash, but what else can you say? You begin noticing that other women in the household bear similar marks, a maid with a black eye, the cook's assistant with finger-shaped bruises on her arm, your mother-in-law with the split lip she attributes to clumsiness. The violence isn't unique to your marriage, it's endemic, a feature of patriarchal household structure where men exercise physical authority over everyone beneath them in the hierarchy. Realizing this doesn't provide comfort, if anything. It's more depressing. This isn't one cruel man. This is a system that grants men permission to enforce their will through violence, and then calls that enforcement righteous correction. proper discipline, justified response to female deficiency. Here's something that might surprise you. Medieval legal records occasionally show women fighting back. A few documented cases describe wives who struck their husbands in self-defense, who left abusive marriages despite social pressure, who testified in church courts about violence they'd endured. These women were exceptional, brave beyond measure, and usually punished for their resistance. A wife who struck her husband could be charged with petty treason violence against one's natural superior, which carried severe penalties including mutilation or death. The legal system didn't just permit husbands' violence toward wives, it actively criminalized wives' violence toward husbands. The power imbalance was codified, enforced, defended as natural order. You don't fight back when your husband strikes you. You've thought about it, fantasy scenarios where you grab something and defend yourself, where you hurt him the way he hurts you, where you somehow seize power in this relationship. But fantasy and reality diverge completely. He's stronger, larger, trained in combat. You're 14, still growing, utterly unskilled in violence. Any physical resistance would be futile and would likely escalate the situation catastrophically. So you employ the only resistance available. You endure. You survive. You cultivate a small, fierce core of self that he can't reach, can't touch, can't correct into submission no matter how many times his hand connects with your face. Do you remember meeting your husband for the first time? Trying to determine whether he'd be kind or cruel? The answer turned out to be both, unpredictably. He can be genuinely thoughtful, bringing you a book he knows you'll enjoy, praising your household management when you've done well, showing unexpected tenderness during intimate moments. But he can also be casually brutal, his violence emerging from frustration or displeasure with the same ease as his kindness emerges from satisfaction. You're learning that abuse doesn't require a monster. It just requires a system that grants certain people power over others and then refuses to meaningfully constrain how that power is exercised. The shocking reality: what you're experiencing wasn't considered abuse by medieval standards, it was correction, discipline, a husband's duty to guide his wife toward proper behaviour. The violence wasn't a tragic aberration from normal marriage, it was a feature of normal marriage. So common and accepted that advice literature discussed it matter-of-factly alongside menu planning and household budgeting. Your bruises weren't evidence of anything wrong with your marriage. They were evidence of a marriage functioning exactly as medieval society designed it to function, with clear hierarchy, male authority, and physical enforcement when other methods of control proved insufficient. That's the real horror, not that you're being hurt, but that hurting you is considered perfectly normal, legally protected, even religiously justified. Your pain is unremarkable. Your suffering is expected. And survival means accepting that this is simply what marriage means. The first time you notice your husband's mistress, she's a serving girl in the kitchens, pretty, dark-haired, probably 16. You catch them together in the storeroom one afternoon when you're doing inventory. They spring apart, his hand dropping from her waist, her face flushing crimson. Your husband meets your eyes without shame or apology. "Leave us," he says flatly. You do. Because what choice do you have? Your hands shake as you walk away, humiliation and anger churning in your stomach. You're his wife. But apparently that means nothing when desire strikes elsewhere. That evening at dinner, he's cordial to you, as though nothing happened. The serving girl brings wine, her eyes downcast, and you realise the entire household probably knows. Servants always know. They see everything, hear everything, and discuss it in the kitchens and stables where nobles never venture. You're being publicly humiliated, and there's nothing you can do about it. Medieval marriage vows required wives to forsake all others. But husbands' vows contained no such promise. Sexual exclusivity was a female obligation, not a mutual one. Here's what medieval law and custom actually said about adultery. It was asymmetrical in every conceivable way. A wife's adultery was grounds for severe punishment, divorce, imprisonment, even execution in extreme cases. It was considered theft of a man's property rights and threatened the legitimacy of his heirs. A husband's adultery, however, was barely noteworthy. Men were understood to have stronger sexual appetites, less impulse control, more entitlement to variety. As long as a husband provided for his wife and legitimate children, his extramarital activities were his own business. Some marriage contracts even included provisions for maintaining mistresses. As you remember from the negotiation discussions, your mother-in-law's response when you gather courage to mention the situation is predictably dismissive. "Men have needs," she says with a shrug. "Be grateful he's discreet enough to keep his mistress below stairs rather than installing her in a separate household like some lords do. Your duty is to produce heirs and manage the household. What he does with serving girls is irrelevant." The casual acceptance stings worse than outright cruelty would. She's telling you that your feelings don't matter, that marital fidelity is a foolish expectation, that you should simply accept your husband's infidelity as natural male behaviour. The mistress isn't an isolated incident. Over the following months, you become aware of others: a merchant's daughter in the village, a widow whose husband owed yours money, even a visiting noblewoman's lady-in-waiting during a feast that lasted several days. Your husband doesn't flaunt these liaisons, but he doesn't hide them either. They're simply part of his life, compartmentalized from his marriage to you. You share his name, his bed when he chooses, his household, but you don't share his fidelity or his respect. Those apparently weren't part of the marriage contract. Historians still argue whether medieval noblewomen were genuinely accepting of their husband's infidelity or simply performed acceptance because expressing hurt was pointless and socially unacceptable. Private letters that survive suggest deep pain wives writing to confidants about humiliation, loneliness, the agony of being replaced in their husband's affections. But publicly, these same women maintained dignified facades, participating in the fiction that their marriages were satisfactory. You'll learn in this performance, smiling through dinners where your husband's current favourite serves at table, pretending not to notice the knowing glances exchanged by guests who find your situation amusing or pitiable. The cruelest aspect is that you're still expected to be sexually available to your husband. He moves between your bed and his mistress's beds with casual ease, and you have no right to refuse him. The marriage debt works only one direction: you owe him sexual access whenever he demands it. But you can't demand fidelity, consideration, or even basic courtesy in return. Some nights he comes to you smelling of another woman's perfume, and you're expected to welcome him, to perform enthusiasm, to pretend you don't notice or don't care. The emotional violence of it exceeds the physical experiences that first traumatized you. Here's a genuinely disturbing detail from medieval theological writings. Some scholars argued that a husband's adultery was actually less sinful than a wife's, because men's sins didn't threaten property inheritance or family bloodlines. A man who slept with unmarried women or widows was merely indulging lust, a venial sin, requiring confession but not serious social consequence. A woman who committed adultery was destroying the fundamental order of society. This wasn't fringe thinking but mainstream theology, taught by universities, preached from pulpits, encoded into law. Your husband's infidelity is a minor moral failing. If you were unfaithful, it would be unforgivable. You've never been tempted toward infidelity partly because you're too young and traumatized to feel desire? partly because the consequences terrify you. But you observe other women who make different choices, and their fates serve as cautionary tales. The neighbouring baroness who took a lover was discovered. Her husband had her confined to a convent for life. Her children declared bastards. Her dower property confiscated. Another noblewoman suspected of adultery never proven was subjected to a humiliating church investigation, examined by male clergy, forced to swear oaths on holy relics while her reputation was destroyed by rumour regardless of the investigation's outcome. The double standard extends beyond sexuality into every aspect of emotional expression. Your husband can rage, strike servants, drink to excess, maintain multiple affairs, and this is considered normal male behaviour. If you show anger, raise your voice, or express dissatisfaction with anything, you're failing at feminine virtue. You're supposed to be patient, forgiving, serene, eternally accommodating. Any deviation from perfect submission marks you as shrewish, difficult, unwomanly. The emotional labour of maintaining constant pleasant compliance while swallowing anger, hurt, and resentment is exhausting in ways you lack vocabulary to express. Your stepdaughter Isabel asks you one day, with the devastating directness of childhood, "Why is Papa kissing the kitchen girl? I thought kissing was for married people." You struggle for an answer that's honest but age-appropriate. "Men sometimes have friendships with other women," you say carefully. "It's complicated." She considers this, her face scrunched in concentration. "When I'm married, I won't let my husband have friendships like that," she announces. You want to tell her she won't have a choice. That marriage for noble women means accepting terms set entirely by men. Instead, you just hug her, holding tight this fierce little girl who still believes in fairness and choice. The mistress situation intensifies when one of them becomes pregnant. The kitchen girl, her name is Marie. You've learned develops the unmistakable signs. Your husband acknowledges the child as his, which is decent of him in a way. Many noblemen simply ignored bastards born to servants. He arranges for Marie to be married quickly to one of the grooms, provided with a small cottage on the estate. Given funds to support the child, the efficiency with which he manages this suggests it's not his first bastard, just the first you've witnessed close up. Here's what medieval inheritance law said about bastards: they couldn't inherit titles or primary estates. But fathers could provide for them through smaller properties, positions in the household or military, or apprenticeships. Noble bastards existed in a strange liminal space, acknowledged but second class, provided for but never equal to legitimate children. Your husband will likely support his illegitimate child adequately. He might even feel some affection for it. But it won't threaten your future children's inheritance, which is apparently all that matters. The emotional impact on you watching your husband's child by another woman being born while you've yet to successfully carry a pregnancy to term is irrelevant. The pregnancy triggers something dark in you envy. You're envious of a serving girl who's accomplished what you failed to do, carry your husband's child successfully. The irrationality doesn't make the feeling less consuming. Marie is younger than you, healthier somehow, and she's done the one thing that would secure your position in this household. When her baby, a boy, naturally is born healthy and robust, you can barely bring yourself to look at him. This squalling infant represents everything you lack, everything you failed to provide. Your husband visits the cottage regularly to see his son. He hasn't visited your chambers for intimate purposes in weeks. You begin to understand that your value is entirely contingent on your reproductive success or failure. When you were pregnant, your husband was attentive, your mother-in-law almost kind, the household deferential. After your miscarriage, you became less valuable, disappointing, but still potentially useful. Now, watching your husband's mistress succeed where you failed, you feel your position in the household eroding. You're the legitimate wife in name, but you're not providing the function that justifies your existence. The bastard in the cottage represents your inadequacy more clearly than any words could. Do you remember when infidelity seemed like something that happened in tragic ballads, not in real marriages? The reality is so much more mundane and so much more crushing. Your husband isn't torn between two great loves. He's simply taking what he wants from multiple women, legitimacy and alliance from you, pleasure and variety from mistresses, heirs from whoever can successfully provide them. You're not even important enough to betray dramatically. You're just one resource among many that he manages according to his needs and desires. Medieval women's private letters occasionally reveal that some wives took quiet satisfaction in their husband's attention being directed elsewhere, less marital rape, less unwanted pregnancy risk, more personal freedom. You can understand that perspective intellectually, but emotionally you're just hurt. Not because you love your husband, you're not sure you even like him most days, but because the infidelity underscores your powerlessness, your irrelevance, the fundamental unfairness of a system where men can do anything and women can do nothing but endure. The shocking reality. Your husband's affairs weren't scandalous by medieval standards. They were normal, expected, barely worth mentioning. Noble marriages were political and economic arrangements, not romantic partnerships. Expecting emotional fidelity was naive, and expecting sexual fidelity was delusional. Men married for heirs and alliances but sought pleasure, companionship, and variety elsewhere. Women married and then spent their lives managing the emotional fallout of husbands who owed them nothing but financial support and occasional presence. Your pain isn't evidence of an unusually bad marriage. It's evidence of marriage functioning exactly as designed, with men having all the freedom and women having all the obligations. The only shocking part is that anyone ever pretended this arrangement was fair, natural, or divinely ordained, rather than what it actually was: systematic male privilege encoded in law, blessed by the church, and enforced through violence and shame until women stopped even imagining alternatives. Your husband dies on a Tuesday morning in autumn, thrown from his horse during a hunt when the animal stumbles in a rabbit hole. The fall breaks his neck a quick death. The attending knights assure you, as though that matters. You're summoned from the still room where you've been preparing winter medicines, and you stand over his body in the courtyard feeling nothing, not grief, not relief, just a strange emptiness where emotion should be. You're 15 years old, you've been married for 2 years, and you're suddenly a widow. Everything is about to change. The household erupts into controlled chaos. Your mother-in-law takes charge immediately, ordering mourning clothes, sending messengers to inform relatives and the king, arranging for the body to be prepared for burial. You stand aside, uncertain of your role, and she snaps at you. Don't just stand there. You're the widow. Act like it. But you don't know how to act. The grief you're supposed to feel is absent, replaced by calculation about what this means for your future. Does that make you a monster? Or just honest about a marriage that was always a transaction rather than a relationship? Here's what medieval law said about widowhood. It was complicated, and it was the only time in a noblewoman's life when she might have genuine autonomy. As a widow, you're entitled to your dower, the 1/3 of your husband's estates that were set aside for your support when you married. You control this property directly, make decisions about it, keep the income it generates. You're no longer under your father's authority or your husband's authority. You're a legal person in your own right, what the law calls a femme sole. It's the closest thing to freedom a medieval noblewoman could experience. And it comes at the cost of your husband's death. But there are complications. Your stepmother-in-law, your husband's mother, believes she's entitled to continued residence in the castle and a share of the state's income. Your stepdaughter Isabel, now 9 years old, is your husband's heir until, unless you produce a posthumous son, you're not pregnant. But no one knows that yet. Your husband's brother, who stands to inherit if Isabel can be set aside or married off strategically, is already circling. The chaplain mentions that young widows are expected to consider remarriage quickly. Your dower would make you an attractive prospect, and remaining single is seen as selfish, even improper. Everyone has plans for you, and none of them involve asking what you want. The funeral is elaborate 3 days of lying in state, a funeral mass with the bishop presiding, burial in the family crypt beneath the chapel. You play your part perfectly, veiled in black, weeping at appropriate moments, though the tears are more exhaustion and uncertainty than grief, accepting condolences from nobles who assess you with calculating eyes. Some of these men are already considering you as a potential bride for themselves or their sons. Your valuable property again, available on the marriage market, and widowhood's brief freedom is already under threat. Historians still argue whether medieval widows genuinely had more power, or whether their apparent autonomy was illusory, constantly threatened by family members and social pressure to remarry. The evidence suggests it varied wildly based on the individual woman's competence, the extent of her dower, her relationships with her late husband's family, and whether she had adult sons who might protect her interests. You have none of these advantages. You're young, inexperienced, childless, and surrounded by your late husband's relatives who view you as an obstacle to their control of the estate. Here's something that might surprise you. Medieval widows could refuse remarriage proposals, at least in theory. Church law required consent for marriage, and a widow's consent couldn't be forced. In practice, the pressure could be overwhelming, families threatening to withhold financial support, kings encouraging strategic marriages for political purposes, economic necessity forcing women to accept proposals they'd rather refuse. Rich widows had more options than poor ones, but even wealthy widows faced enormous pressure to remarry and thus placed themselves back under male authority. 3 weeks after your husband's death, the first formal marriage proposal arrives. It's from a baron 30 years older than you, a widower himself with 6 children, whose estates border your dower lands. The proposal is presented by your mother-in-law, who strongly encourages you to accept. You're too young to manage properties alone, she argues. You need a husband's protection and guidance. This is an excellent match. What she means is this marriage would benefit the family by creating an alliance, and your preferences are irrelevant. You ask for time to consider, which is grudgingly granted 1 week. You spend that week actually calculating your options for perhaps the first time in your life. Your dower includes 3 manors generating substantial income enough to support you comfortably if managed well. You could refuse remarriage, live independently on your dower estates, control your own life for the first time. But the risks are significant. Without a husband's protection, you're vulnerable to legal challenges, banditry, and political machinations. Managing estates requires knowledge you're still acquiring, and the social pressure is immense. Unmarried women are viewed with suspicion, their independence seen as unnatural, even dangerous. The more immediate threat comes from within the family. Your husband's brother formally challenges your dower claim, arguing that since you produced no children during the marriage, you shouldn't receive the full 3rd portion. It's a weak legal argument. Dower rights weren't contingent on childbearing, but it's expensive to defend, requiring lawyers and potentially church court involvement. He's betting that you'll remarry rather than fight, thus transferring the problem to your new husband. Your mother-in-law remains conspicuously neutral, which you correctly interpret as support for her son over you. Here's a detail from legal records that reveals the precarity of widows' positions. Estate battles between widows and their late husbands' relatives were common enough that standardized legal procedures existed for resolving them. Widows frequently had to prove their marriage had been consummated, that their dower had been properly assigned, that they'd fulfilled their wifely duties adequately. The burden of proof fell on the widow, and the process could take years, during which her income and security remained in limbo. You're learning that widowhood's freedom comes with its own forms of vulnerability. Your stepdaughter Isabel complicates everything. You love her genuinely. She's the one relationship in this household that feels real rather than performative. But legally, she's your husband's heir, which means decisions about her future affect the entire estate. Your mother-in-law wants Isabel betrothed immediately to her uncle, your late husband's brother, creating a marriage that would keep all the property within the immediate family. The idea of 9-year-old Isabel being betrothed to a man in his 40s makes you feel ill, but your opinion carries limited weight. You're her stepmother, not her guardian. That authority rests with male relatives. You make a decision that surprises everyone. Including yourself, you refuse the Baron's proposal and announce your intention to manage your dower independently. The reaction is predictably negative. Your mother-in-law is furious, warning that you're being foolish and stubborn. The chaplain lectures you about women's need for male guidance. Your late husband's brother increases his legal pressure, hoping to force you into remarriage by making independent widowhood untenable. But something has shifted in you. You've spent 2 years being controlled, corrected, used. Your husband's death has opened a door, and you're not ready to let it close again. Medieval conduct literature is filled with warnings about lusty widows who refuse remarriage young women, supposedly driven by sexual desire and improper independence to reject male authority. The stereotype reveals cultural anxiety about women who escaped patriarchal control. You're not driven by lust, honestly. After your marriage experiences, you're relieved to have your body to yourself. But you are driven by a desperate desire for autonomy, for the chance to make your own decisions, for freedom from constant supervision and correction. If that makes you improper, so be it. The battle for your independence plays out over months. You hire a lawyer, something you can do as a widow, but couldn't do as a wife, to defend your dower rights. You begin learning estate management seriously, working closely with stewards and bailiffs, understanding the income sources and obligations. You make mistakes, certainly, but they're your mistakes. Consequences you face rather than being shielded from or blamed for by a husband. Slowly, painfully, you begin to feel competent, capable, like an actual person rather than decorative property. Do you remember standing at the castle gate being turned back by guards who said you needed permission to leave? Now you can leave when you choose. You ride out to inspect your dower manors, travelling with an escort but making your own schedule, your own decisions about routes and timing. The physical freedom feels profound after 2 years of restriction. You can walk the battlements at sunset if you want. You can skip dinner if you're not hungry. You can read late into the night without someone telling you it's time for bed. These tiny freedoms feel revolutionary, but the pressure to remarry never relents. Proposals arrive regularly, some from men genuinely interested in you, others transparently interested in your property. Your family writes urging you to accept suitable offers, worried that your refusal damages their ability to arrange marriages for your younger sisters. The king's representative mentions that young widows holding valuable properties have obligations to remarry strategically for the realm's stability. Everyone has an opinion about your life, and no one seems to consider that you might have legitimate reasons for wanting to remain unmarried. Here's the shocking reality about medieval widowhood. It was the only life stage where noble women could potentially experience autonomy, and society worked relentlessly to make that autonomy as brief and limited as possible. The legal rights existed, yes, but the social, economic, and political pressure to return to male authority was enormous and unceasing. Widows who successfully maintained independence were exceptional strong-willed, wealthy enough to resist pressure, skilled at navigating legal and social challenges, and often just lucky that circumstances aligned in their favour. You're fighting for something most medieval women never experienced the right to control your own life. It's exhausting, lonely, and uncertain. But it's also yours, this struggle, this autonomy, this brief window where you're more than someone's daughter or someone's wife. You're just yourself, learning who that person might be when not defined entirely by relationship to men. The freedom might not last, remarriage pressure continues, legal challenges threaten your resources, and you're aware that one wrong decision could force you back into dependence. But for now, for this moment, you're free, and that freedom, however fragile and contested, feels like finally breathing after years of suffocation. Not every medieval noblewoman followed the path you've walked. Some were born into circumstances that gave them unexpected leverage, and they used it with ruthless intelligence. You hear stories of these women whispered in the solar during needlework sessions, mentioned in letters from your mother, discussed by travelling merchants who carry gossip along with their goods. These exceptional women fascinate and terrify you in equal measure, representing possibilities you never imagined existed within the rigid confines of medieval marriage. Eleanor of Aquitaine is the name everyone mentions first, Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right. She was married at 15 to the King of France, an arranged marriage like yours. But she brought territories so vast that she had genuine negotiating power. When that marriage produced only daughters and proved incompatible, she pursued an annulment on grounds of consanguinity. Then she married Henry of Anjou, who became King of England, making her Queen of England at 30. She outlived Henry, ruled as regent for her sons, survived imprisonment, and died at 82, having shaped European politics for decades. Her story proves that women with sufficient resources and determination could rewrite the rules entirely. But Eleanor was exceptional, even among exceptions, a duchess in her own right, spectacularly wealthy, married to kings. What about women closer to your own circumstances? You learn about Jeanne de Clisson, a Breton noblewoman whose husband was executed by the French king. Rather than accepting widowhood quietly or remarrying as expected, she sold her estates, purchased 3 warships, painted them black with red sails, and became a pirate hunting French vessels. For 13 years she terrorised French shipping, becoming known as the Lioness of Brittany. She eventually remarried on her own terms to an English lieutenant who supported her vendetta. The story sounds like legend, but it's documented in multiple chronicles. A noblewoman who transformed grief into warfare and chose her own destiny. Here's what these exceptional women had in common: they found leverage and exploited it ruthlessly. Maybe it was inherited lands that gave them independent wealth. Maybe it was powerful relatives who supported their autonomy. Maybe it was sheer force of personality that allowed them to dominate situations where they should have been powerless. Maybe it was simply being willing to break social rules so flagrantly that society couldn't contain them. Historians still argue whether these women were genuinely empowered or simply anomalies that prove the rule of female subordination. Perhaps they were both exceptions that reveal the system's limits, while also showing that those limits could occasionally be transcended. Closer to home, you've heard about Countess Matilda of Tuscany, who inherited vast territories in Italy and chose her own husbands, both marriages strategic but on her terms. She commanded armies personally, riding into battle in armour, leading troops against the Holy Roman Emperor. She donated her lands to the papacy, a political move that shaped Italian politics for centuries. She negotiated directly with kings, popes, and emperors as an equal, and she did all this while technically being subject to the same laws that restrict you, laws about female submission, male guardianship, women's inherent inferiority. She simply ignored them and dared anyone to stop her. You wonder what made these women different. Were they born with some quality you lack: courage, ruthlessness, ambition? Or were they simply placed in circumstances that revealed capabilities any woman might possess if given the chance? Your own brief experience with widowhood's autonomy suggests the latter. When you had to manage estates independently, you discovered you could. When you had to negotiate with lawyers and stewards, you learned how. Perhaps capacity isn't the issue. Perhaps it's simply that most women never get opportunities to discover what they're capable of beyond the narrow roles assigned them. Here's a detail that might surprise you: some noblewomen manipulated the arranged marriage system itself. They'd accept betrothals, but then find grounds for annulment, discovering new evidence of consanguinity, claiming non-consummation, developing sudden religious vocations that required convent residence instead of marriage. Some women went through multiple betrothals and annulments, effectively controlling their marital status through strategic use of church law. It required wealth for legal fees, knowledge of canonical regulations, and willingness to engage in prolonged disputes, but it was possible. A few women made careers of it, remaining technically available for marriage while never actually completing the transaction. You've also learned about women who used their positions as wives to wield genuine political power. When husbands were away at war or on pilgrimage, wives governed estates with full authority. Some women proved so competent that their husbands increasingly delegated control even when present. The Paston letters from England document Margaret Paston managing the family's complex legal battles, military defence of properties under siege, and financial negotiations, while her husband handled court politics. She wasn't exceptional in her activities. Many noble women did similar work, but she was exceptional in that her letters survived, providing documentation of the work medieval wives actually performed when circumstances required it. The religious path offered another escape route from typical wifely submission. Some women who found marriage intolerable retreated to convents, either with their husband's permission or without it. Becoming a nun required dowry payments to the convent, essentially another arranged transaction. But it offered community with other women, intellectual pursuits like reading and manuscript copying, and freedom from sexual obligations and pregnancy risk. Some convents were governed by abbesses who wielded significant political and economic power, commanding respect from bishops and nobles, managing extensive properties, and living lives of relative autonomy compared to their married sisters. Historians have documented cases where noble women deliberately chose religious life over marriage, sometimes fiercely resisting family pressure to wed. Saint Christina of Marchiate ran away from an arranged marriage, lived in hiding for years, and eventually established a priory where she became a renowned mystic and spiritual advisor to nobles and clergy. Her story is preserved in a medieval biography that presents her refusal to marry as holy resistance to worldly corruption. The Church sometimes supported women's religious vocations even when families objected, creating rare situations where female autonomy was not just permitted but celebrated. You think about Isabel, your stepdaughter, who at 9 already faces betrothal negotiations. Could you give her knowledge that might help her navigate what's coming? Could you teach her the strategies these exceptional women used: how to find leverage, exploit legal technicalities, cultivate powerful allies, or at least recognize that submission isn't the only option, even when it's the expected one? The idea feels dangerous but necessary. She deserves to know that women can have power, even in a system designed to deny them any. Here's something genuinely fascinating from medieval records' women's networks. Noble women maintained extensive correspondence with each other, sharing information about husbands, legal strategies, property management, and political developments. These networks operated somewhat independently of male-dominated power structures, creating spaces where women could advise, support, and strategize with each other. Some historians argue these networks constituted a kind of shadow government, where women exercised power informally that they couldn't wield formally. You've begun cultivating your own connections with neighbouring noblewomen, learning that collective female knowledge is itself a form of power. The exceptional women weren't all paragons of virtue, which somehow makes them more interesting. Some use their power cruelly, oppressing peasants on their estates or betraying other women for political advantage. Some were murderers. There are documented cases of noble women poisoning abusive husbands or eliminating romantic rivals. The moral ambiguity suggests that power itself is neutral. Women with power were just as capable of using it badly as men were. The shocking part isn't that powerful women were automatically good, it's that they could be powerful at all in a system supposedly designed to prevent exactly that. You've also heard cautionary tales about women who attempted independence and failed catastrophically. The noblewoman who refused remarriage and had her estates confiscated by the king. The widow who tried to manage properties alone and was swindled by dishonest stewards. The wife who left an abusive husband and was forcibly returned, then confined to a tower for the rest of her life as punishment for her disobedience. These stories circulate alongside the success stories, reminding women that resistance carries risks and that not everyone who attempts autonomy achieves it. Do you remember believing that your fate was entirely determined by your father's negotiations and your husband's authority? The exceptional women's stories reveal that fate has some flexibility, that the system, however oppressive, has cracks where determined women can find leverage. You're not Eleanor of Aquitaine with a duchy and royal connections. You're not Jeanne de Clisson with 3 warships and a vendetta. But you're a widow with dower rights, legal standing, and knowledge of what's possible. That might be enough. The question becomes, what will you do with your brief window of autonomy? Will you eventually remarry because the pressure becomes unbearable? Or because you find someone who offers genuine partnership, will you maintain independence? Becoming one of those formidable widows who manage estates competently and refuse to relinquish control? Will you help Isabel find her own path through the arranged marriage system, perhaps giving her tools and knowledge that you lacked? Or will circumstances force you back into submission despite your desires? Medieval history is full of might-have-beens and what-ifs around these exceptional women. What if more noble women had inherited property in their own right? What if church law around consent had been consistently enforced? What if women's education had been prioritised equally with men's? What if the legal doctrine of coverture hadn't existed? Allowing married women to retain independent legal identity, historians speculate about how different medieval society might have been if these systematic barriers to female power hadn't existed. But they did exist. And the exceptional women are notable precisely because they succeeded despite overwhelming structural disadvantages. The shocking reality: medieval noblewomen weren't universally powerless victims. Some found ways to exercise power, control their destinies, and shape political outcomes despite operating in a profoundly patriarchal system. But these exceptions don't disprove the rule, they highlight it. The fact that we can name these exceptional women, that their stories circulated as remarkable rather than normal, proves how unusual female power was. For every Eleanor of Aquitaine, there were thousands of noblewomen whose names are lost, who accepted their arranged marriages, endured their restricted lives, and died without ever experiencing the autonomy that should have been their birthright. The exceptional women give you hope, but they also remind you how exceptional you'd have to be to join their ranks, and how many women simply couldn't overcome the barriers that contained them. The chapel bells toll for morning prayers, but today you're not attending Mass. Today you're meeting with the bishop about something medieval society considered both shameful and necessary, ending your marriage. Not your current widowhood that's permanent, but helping another woman in your household escape hers. Lady Catherine, wife of one of your late husband's knights, has approached you desperately seeking assistance. Her husband beats her savagely, has broken her arm twice, and recently threatened to kill her. She wants an annulment, and she's asking for your help navigating the church courts. You've agreed because you remember your own marital violence, and because your widowhood gives you resources and standing that she lacks. Medieval marriage was supposedly indissoluble, what God has joined. Let no man separate. But in practice, the Church recognised several grounds for annulment, which technically meant declaring that a valid marriage had never existed in the first place. The most common ground was consanguinity blood relationship within 7 degrees, later reduced to 4, given how intermarried medieval nobility was. Most couples could find some distant common ancestor if they looked hard enough and had sufficient motivation and money to pursue it. Catherine's marriage might be dissolvable on these grounds, but it will require investigation, testimony, legal fees, and the bishop's approval. The process could take years. Here's what actually happened in medieval annulment proceedings. They were expensive, politically complicated, and overwhelmingly favoured men. A husband seeking annulment might claim non-consummation due to his wife's witchcraft, causing impotence, a convenient fiction that blamed the woman while freeing the man. A husband could claim he was forced into marriage under duress. But wives seeking annulment faced extreme scepticism. Catherine's claim of physical abuse won't be sufficient. Grounds cruelty wasn't recognised as legitimate cause for dissolving marriage. She'll need to prove consanguinity or non-consummation, both difficult for a woman who's been married 5 years and has borne 2 children. You're learning that the Church occupied a contradictory position on marriage. Officially, marriage required consent from both parties, a surprisingly progressive doctrine that theoretically gave women veto power over unwanted marriages. But in practice, consent we interpreted loosely. If a woman went through the ceremony and didn't physically resist, that was taken as consent regardless of her actual feelings. If she was 12 years old and terrified, that was still consent. The gap between theoretical doctrine and practical application was wide enough to swallow thousands of unwilling brides. The meeting with the bishop is uncomfortable. He's a practical man in his 60s who's heard every marital complaint imaginable and believes most of them are exaggerated. He listens to Catherine's testimony about broken bones, black eyes, and threatened murder with visible skepticism. Husbands have authority to correct their wives, he says mildly. Perhaps you provoke these corrections through disobedience. Catherine's face flushes with anger and humiliation. You intervene, carefully framing the request not as escape from violence, which the bishop clearly doesn't consider legitimate, but as a canonical investigation into possible consanguinity that has only recently come to light. This shifts the conversation from Catherine's suffering to a technical legal matter the Church can engage with. Historians still argue whether medieval church courts genuinely tried to protect women or simply provided a pressure valve that kept marital dissatisfaction from destabilizing society more broadly. The evidence is mixed. Some bishops took women's complaints seriously and granted separations or annulments when circumstances warranted. Others rubber-stamped male authority and sent women back to abusive situations with lectures about wifely submission. Much depended on the individual bishop's character, the woman's social status, and whether she had powerful male relatives willing to support her claim, Here's a detail that reveals the system's cynicism. Wealthy couples could purchase papal dispensations that retroactively legitimized technically invalid marriages or dispensed with impediments to remarriage. The same consanguinity that supposedly made a marriage void could be overlooked for the right price and political connections. Eleanor of Aquitaine's annulment from Louis VII was granted partly because both parties wanted it and had sufficient influence to make it happen, despite the religious justifications cited. Conversely, countless poor women trapped in genuinely abusive marriages had no recourse because they lacked money for legal fees and influence to push their cases through church bureaucracy. Catherine's case drags on for months. Investigators interview relatives trying to establish whether any consanguinity exists. Witnesses are called to testify about the marriage's circumstances. Her husband fights the proceeding viciously, not because he wants to remain married, but because an annulment might cost him property or social standing. He claims Catherine is lying, is motivated by adultery, is mentally unstable. The character assassination is brutal and publicly humiliating. You support her through it, providing money for legal fees and a place to stay away from her husband, but you can't protect her from the social consequences of being a woman who dares to challenge her marriage. Some women took more desperate measures. You've heard stories, some confirmed, some possibly legendary, of wives who poisoned abusive husbands, claiming afterward that he died from natural illness. Medieval medicine's limited diagnostic capabilities made this plausible. Many illnesses and poisonings produce similar symptoms. Were these women murderers, or were they defending themselves using the only means available? Church courts treated them as murderers if discovered, but popular sympathy sometimes protected them. Juries of peers occasionally refused to convict women accused of killing violent husbands, engaging in a kind of medieval jury nullification. The religious vocation path offered another escape, though it required the husband's consent or the woman's willingness to simply abandon her marriage. Some wives entered convents without permission, claiming divine calling that superseded earthly obligations. The church faced a dilemma. Denying genuine religious vocations was spiritually dangerous, but encouraging wives to abandon husbands destabilized marriage. The solution was typically case-by-case assessment, favoring women with strong religious credentials or powerful patrons. A noblewoman claiming mystical visions might be supported. A peasant woman claiming the same might be returned to her husband. Here's something that sounds invented but appears in multiple historical records: trial by ordeal for accused adulteresses. A wife accused of infidelity might be required to carry hot iron, plunge her hand in boiling water, or undergo other physical tests. If the wounds healed cleanly within 3 days, God had proven her innocence. If they festered, she was guilty. The church officially ended this practice in 1215, but informal versions persisted in some regions for centuries. The ordeal's existence reveals how desperately society wanted to control female sexuality, and how willing it was to use torture disguised as divine judgment to accomplish that. Catherine's annulment is eventually granted not because the church acknowledged her suffering, but because investigators found a fourth-degree consanguinity relationship that technically invalidated the marriage from the beginning. It's a hollow victory in some ways. The annulment declares her 5-year marriage never existed, meaning her children are now technically illegitimate and she has no claim to property or support from her former husband. But she's free, and that's what she wanted most. She enters a convent shortly after the annulment is finalized, choosing religious life over any risk of remarriage. You understand her choice completely. Do you remember your own wedding? Standing at the altar promising to obey a man you barely knew, the church called that a sacrament, a holy union blessed by God. But watching Catherine struggle to escape a marriage that was destroying her, you wonder about the gap between theological ideals and lived reality. Marriage was supposedly about mutual love and support, yet the legal structure granted husbands near total power and wives almost none. The contradiction was embedded in the system itself. Your experience helping Catherine changes you. You begin corresponding with other noblewomen about their marital situations, offering advice and occasionally financial support for those seeking annulments. You're not exactly running an underground railroad for unhappy wives, but you're creating a network where women can share information about sympathetic bishops, effective legal arguments, and survival strategies. Some of your male neighbours disapprove one calls you a corrupting influence, who encourages wifely rebellion. You take it as a compliment. Medieval women's limited options for escaping bad marriages meant that prevention became crucial. Some noble women insisted on meeting their proposed husbands before betrothal, refusing matches that seemed dangerous. Some negotiated marriage contracts with unusual provision clauses protecting their property rights, limiting their husband's disciplinary authority, or guaranteeing their ability to return to their birth families if the marriage proved unbearable. These negotiations required wealth, powerful relatives willing to advocate for the woman, and a prospective husband desperate enough for the match to accept unfavourable terms. Most women had none of these advantages. The Church's position on marital consent created interesting legal situations. Technically, a marriage forced on an unwilling woman was invalid, but proving you were forced years after the wedding was nearly impossible, especially since going through the ceremony without active physical resistance was considered implicit consent. Some women exploited this by running away before the wedding and claiming afterward they'd never consented, if they made it to a convent and took vows before being caught. Their religious commitment superseded the marriage contract. It was a risky strategy that required courage, planning, and luck. But some women successfully escaped arranged marriages this way. Here's the shocking reality about medieval divorce and annulment. The theoretical protections for women consent requirements, grounds for dissolving invalid marriages. Church court oversight existed but was systematically undermined by practical, financial, and political considerations. The same institution that declared marriage indissoluble granted annulments to powerful men who wanted to remarry. The same bishops who preached about mutual marital obligations told beaten wives to submit more perfectly. The same legal system that required female consent to marriage interpreted consent so loosely that it became meaningless. The gap between what the Church claimed to offer women and what it actually provided was vast, and countless women fell into that gap, trapped in marriages that were destroying them with no legitimate escape route except death their husbands or, sometimes, their own. You've been corresponding with your younger sister, and her latest letter brings news that makes your heart sink. She's been betrothed to a German count, a man she'll meet for the first time at their wedding in 3 months. She's 13, the same age you were when you married, and reading her anxious questions brings back every terror you felt standing where she now stands. But you also notice something fascinating. Her experience differs from yours in small but significant ways that reveal how arranged marriage varied dramatically across medieval Europe. What you endured in France and England wasn't universal regional customs created wildly different experiences for noble women depending on where they lived. Your sister's betrothal contract, which your father enclosed with her letter, contains provisions you never had. German customary law in her future husband's region requires the groom to provide a mourning gift property transferred to the bride the morning after the wedding night, which becomes hers absolutely regardless of what happens later. It's not a loan or conditional grant, it's outright ownership that can't be revoked even if the marriage ends. This practice, called Morgengabe, exists throughout Germanic territories, but not in France where you married. Your sister will have independent wealth from her first day of marriage in a way you never did until widowhood. Here's what regional variations in medieval marriage law actually meant. A noblewoman's experience could differ radically based on where she married. Scandinavian law gave women substantial property rights and easier access to divorce. Byzantine empresses wielded political power unthinkable for Western European queens. Spanish noblewomen in Reconquista territories sometimes inherited and governed domains independently. Italian city-states had different customs than rural French fiefdoms. The broad category medieval marriage obscures massive variation in women's actual rights, responsibilities, and opportunities depending on the specific legal and cultural context they inhabited. You've been researching these variations obsessively, partly to help your sister, partly to understand your own experience better. In Norway and Iceland, women could initiate divorce for specific causes, including impotence. Cross-dressing genuinely listed in the laws. Or if the husband attempted to take them abroad without permission, a wife could declare divorce publicly before witnesses, dividing property according to established formulas, and remarry freely afterward. The contrast with your own experience, where divorce was impossible and annulment required years of church court proceedings, is striking. Medieval marriage wasn't universally oppressive. Some legal systems granted women significant autonomy. Scandinavian marriage customs contained other surprises. The bride's consent was required explicitly, not just implied through her failure to flee. She participated in negotiating her own marriage contract, sitting at the table with fathers and future husbands. The wedding ceremony itself involved both parties giving consent publicly, and a woman's yes had to be clearly audible to witnesses. These weren't just theoretical requirements. Sagas document cases where marriages were invalidated because the bride's consent was unclear or coerced. Historians still argue whether these legal protections translated into genuine female autonomy or remained largely symbolic, but they certainly exceeded what you experienced in French-influenced marriage customs. Here's a detail that reveals cultural differences in parts of Scandinavia. The bride kept her birth name after marriage rather than taking her husband's name. She remained legally connected to her birth family, who retained some responsibility for her welfare and some claim on her loyalty. The practice reflects a fundamentally different conception of marriage, less about a woman transferring completely from one family to another, more about two families creating alliance while the woman maintained independent identity. You took your husband's name immediately, signalling complete transfer of ownership from father to husband. Your sister, marrying into German territory with different customs, might maintain more connection to your birth family. Byzantine empresses had experiences so different from yours they barely seem comparable. Empresses were crowned in separate ceremonies, wielded their own imperial seals, commanded their own households with independent budgets, and occasionally governed as regents or sole rulers. Empress Irene ruled the Byzantine Empire outright, from 797 to 802, not as regent but as emperor in her own right. She used the masculine title. Empress Theodora in the 6th century rose from actress to co-ruler, her opinions shaping imperial policy and her image appearing on coins beside her husband Justinian's. These women operated in a cultural context where female power wasn't unthinkable unusual. Perhaps, but possible. The Byzantine legal code gave women more property rights than Western European law. A wife controlled her dowry throughout marriage. Her husband couldn't sell or mortgage it without her consent. If widowed, she received her dowry back plus half the couple's joint acquisitions during marriage. Byzantine women regularly appeared in court representing their own interests, signed contracts independently, and managed business enterprises. The contrast with Western coverture, where marriage extinguished women's legal identity, is dramatic. Your experience wasn't universal, it was specific to the legal traditions that governed your particular marriage. Here's something that might surprise you. Islamic marriage law in medieval Spain granted women rights that would have shocked Western Christian nobles. Muslim brides in Al-Andalus could include virtually any clause in their marriage contracts restricting their husband's ability to take additional wives, requiring his permission before taking a second wife, guaranteeing her right to work outside the home, even requiring him to visit her a certain number of nights per week. These contracts were legally enforceable in Islamic courts. Women could initiate divorce under specific circumstances and retain their dowries afterward. Jewish women in medieval Spain had similar contractual flexibility under rabbinical law. Meanwhile, you had essentially no ability to negotiate your marriage's terms. Regional variations extended to violence and discipline. In some jurisdictions, a husband's right to physically correct his wife was unlimited. In others, excessive violence was grounds for separation. Welsh law codes from the medieval period itemised which acts constituted illegal violence, striking the wife's face, drawing blood, causing permanent injury. English common law developed the rule of thumb concept, possibly apocryphal, but revealing nonetheless a husband could beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb. The fact that limits existed at all in some regions while others imposed no restrictions reveals that marital violence wasn't universally accepted as inevitable or appropriate, even in medieval patriarchy. You wonder what your life might have been like if you'd married in a different region with different customs, if you'd had a Scandinavian marriage where your consent was required explicitly and divorce was accessible, if you'd had a Byzantine marriage where you controlled your own property, if you'd had a Muslim Spanish marriage where you could negotiate contractual protections, would you have been happier, safer, more autonomous? Or would patriarchy have found other mechanisms to control you regardless of the specific legal framework? Do you remember believing that all medieval marriages were essentially identical, just varying degrees of the same oppression? Learning about regional variations complicates that understanding. Some legal systems were genuinely more protective of women than others. Some cultures granted women more autonomy, more property rights, more voice in their own destinies. But even the most progressive medieval marriage systems still operated within fundamentally patriarchal frameworks. Scandinavian women could initiate divorce, but they still married young to men chosen by families. Byzantine empresses wielded power, but only a handful reached such positions. Better conditions don't equal equality. They just mean the cage is slightly larger. Historians still argue about how to interpret these regional variations. Some emphasize the differences, arguing that medieval marriage wasn't monolithically oppressive, but rather a spectrum of experiences ranging from truly horrific to occasionally equitable. Others emphasize the commonalities: universal young marriage ages for girls, male authority over family decisions, restricted female sexuality, women's primary value as child-bearers. Perhaps both perspectives contain truth. The system was universally patriarchal, but the specific mechanisms of patriarchal control and the spaces for female agency varied significantly based on region, culture, and legal tradition. Your sister's upcoming German marriage will differ from yours in specific ways: better property protections, possibly more consensual courtship practices, different household customs, but she'll still be 13 marrying a stranger, still be expected to submit to male authority, still face pregnancy risks and restricted autonomy. The fundamental structure remains the same even as specific details vary. You write back to her with this understanding, offering practical advice based on your experience while acknowledging that her experience won't be identical. You tell her about the Morgengabe and why it matters. You tell her to negotiate whatever protection she can into a marriage contract. You tell her that survival is possible, that she's stronger than she knows, that she'll learn and adapt and endure. Here's the shocking reality about regional variations in medieval marriage. They proved the system was contingent, not inevitable. If Scandinavian law could grant women divorce rights, why couldn't French law? If Byzantine empresses could wield political power, why couldn't Western European queens? If Islamic contracts could protect wives' interests, why couldn't Christian contracts? The variations reveal that medieval patriarchy made choices about how to structure marriage and family law choices that could have been different, that were different elsewhere, that might have granted women more autonomy if the culture had valued female agency differently. Your suffering wasn't inevitable or universal. It was the product of specific legal and cultural traditions that could have been otherwise. And that did look different in other regions. That might be the most frustrating realization of all. Not that medieval marriage was universally terrible, but that it didn't have to be as terrible as yours was. Better was possible. Some women got better. You just weren't one of them. You're now 18 years old, 3 years widowed, and standing in your castle's great hall watching your stepdaughter Isabel prepare for her own wedding. She's 12, the same age you were when you married, but her experience will be different because you've made it different. You've spent the past 3 years using your widow's authority to ensure this, negotiating with her betrothed's family for contractual protections you never had, teaching her about property law and household management, preparing her for what's coming in ways no one prepared you. The cycle continues, but perhaps with slight variations that might compound over generations into genuine change. The medieval arranged marriage system didn't end suddenly. It evolved slowly, almost imperceptibly, across centuries. The changes that eventually transformed medieval marriage into something closer to the companionate partnerships we recognize today didn't come from revolution, but from gradual accumulation of small modifications, individual women negotiating better terms, church courts slowly expanding grounds for annulment, economic changes that made women's labour more valuable, cultural shifts that began valuing affection alongside alliance. You're witnessing and participating in these incremental changes, even if you won't live to see their ultimate outcome. Here's what actually changed medieval marriage over time. The idea of consent became more robust and enforceable. Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 required public announcement of betrothals and investigations into possible impediments before weddings could proceed. Consent had to be freely given, and forcing someone into marriage was increasingly treated as invalid. These weren't just theoretical pronouncements. Church courts actually annulled forced marriages with growing frequency in the 13th and 14th centuries. The changes didn't happen quickly or uniformly, and countless women remained trapped in unwanted marriages. But the direction of change favoured increasing female agency in marriage formation. Economic changes mattered too. As medieval towns grew and commerce expanded, some women gained economic independence through trades, inheritance, or business ventures. A woman with her own wealth had negotiating power in marriage that propertyless women lacked. Widows like you, who controlled dower estates, could refuse remarriage or demand favourable terms if they did remarry. The growth of a money economy slowly eroded some aspects of feudal marriage arrangements where women were purely tokens of alliance between landed families. Money created options that land alone didn't provide. Cultural shifts occurred in how people thought about marriage's purpose. Early medieval theology emphasized marriage primarily as remedy for lust and mechanism for producing legitimate heirs. By the later Middle Ages, affection and companionship were increasingly discussed as legitimate marriage goals. The concept of courtly love, however problematic in its own ways at least, introduced the idea that emotional connection between men and women was desirable. These romantic ideas initially developed outside marriage, in relationships between knights and unattainable ladies, but slowly the notion that married couples might actually like each other began to infiltrate marriage expectations. Historians still argue about how much these changes actually improved women's lived experiences versus simply creating new forms of patriarchal control disguised as progress. Teaching women to desire their arranged marriages through romantic ideology might be more insidious than acknowledging marriages as practical arrangements. Granting theoretical consent rights while maintaining economic and social pressure that made refusal impossible might be crueler than overt coercion. The changes were real but ambiguous in their impact. Here's something that reveals the complexity